After decades of debate and investigation, scholars gradually reached a broad consensus. The region described in Hittite texts as Arzawa corresponds to what we today call Western Anatolia. In the early years of Hittitology, however, Arzawa was repeatedly misplaced, just like many other ancient geographical names. Because it appeared in a small number of diplomatic letters exchanged with Egypt, some researchers assumed it had to lie somewhere near the eastern Mediterranean. This assumption hardened into a fixed idea, and for a time, Arzawa was even located in the Chukurova plain. Only after Kitzuwatna was firmly identified in that region did Arzawa slowly retreat westward in scholarly reconstructions, finally settling where it had belonged all along. The greatest weakness in reconstructing the history of Western Anatolia is the near-total absence of local written sources. Unlike central Anatolia, the region has not yielded archives or long historical inscriptions that could illuminate its political or cultural development. A handful of hieroglyphic inscriptions carved into rock faces near Karabel and Afyon, along with graffiti discovered in the mountains near Lake Buffer, provide little more than hints. These traces offer no clear historical narratives. At best, they suggest the geographical spread of political influence, not the structure of states or the sequence of events. As a result, nearly everything known about Arzawa comes indirectly from Hittite records found at Hattusa. This dependence creates a serious problem. Even for the history of the Hittite state itself, these archives are incomplete and selective. When used to reconstruct the past of rival regions, their limitations become even more apparent. The texts were produced by a political center describing enemies and competitors. Neutrality was never their purpose. Outside Anatolia, Arzawa appears only rarely. A few Egyptian diplomatic letters mention it, and scattered references occur in archives from northern Syria. Beyond these isolated cases, the name vanishes entirely from the written record of the broader Near East. Archaeology has so far failed to bridge this gap. Despite decades of excavation across Western Anatolia, no clearly defined material culture can be confidently labelled as Arzawan. There is no distinctive architectural style, burial tradition, or artifact assemblage that can be isolated as uniquely belonging to Arzawa. Apart from a few reliefs, occasional seals, and scattered ceramic finds, even evidence for a strong Hittite or Luwian presence remains thin. Numerous sites from the 2nd millennium BCE have been excavated, yet their ancient names are unknown, and their connection to the political entities described in the texts remains speculative. Researchers moving through the landscape cannot match what they see with the places described in the written sources. The geography of Arzawa exists largely on paper, not in the ground. Even the internal structure of Arzawa remains unclear. It was not a single unified state throughout its history, but a shifting collection of territories whose borders changed over time. What Arzawa meant in earlier centuries was not the same as what the name represented later. By the time of the great Hittite kings of the 13th century, BCE, the term referred not only to a core kingdom, but also to several neighbouring states, including Mira, the land along the Sehar River, Apawiya, and Hapala. Later still, Wilusa was drawn into this political orbit. In effect, Arzawa became a regional system rather than a single country. Its general location can be outlined only in broad strokes. The western boundary was the Aegean Sea, along whose coast outside powers occasionally intruded and claimed influence. The southern, northern, and eastern borders were far more fluid. To the east, the frontier with the Hittite heartland was never stable. It shifted repeatedly in response to war, alliances, and internal change. Rather than a fixed line, It was a zone of constant negotiation and conflict, shaped by geography and military pressure alike. Culturally, Western Anatolia became part of the wider Near Eastern scribal world during the 2nd millennium BC. Like Kizzuwatna, the region adopted cuneiform writing as part of its engagement with larger political systems. Unlike Kizzuwatna, however, Arzawa never dominated the Hittite state, nor exercised cultural leadership over it. Still, specialists from the region were occasionally active beyond its borders. Diplomatic officials and envoys were expected to read and write in Hittite, and sometimes in Akkadian, even if they did not use these languages for local administration. The dominance of Hittite in international correspondence is particularly visible in exchanges with Egypt, where Hittite replaced Akkadian as the medium of communication. Whether Arzawa produced written records in its own language remains unknown. No local archives have been found. Yet it is not impossible that translations of treaties or official documents once existed in regional centres and await discovery. If such archives are ever uncovered, they would radically transform our understanding of Western Anatolia during this period. What little historical information we possess is overwhelmingly military in nature. The texts focus on campaigns, conflicts, and political tensions because these were the moments when Arzawa entered the Hittite field of vision. Almost nothing is said about its economy, religious practices, literary traditions, or systems of belief. Outside a few letters and divinatory texts, the internal life of the region remains silent. The earliest references to Arzawa date to the formative period of the Hittite state. At that time, the name appears in an older form, suggesting a long-standing political identity. These early notices are few and vague. They tell us almost nothing about the structure or size of the country. What they do reveal is persistent resistance. Arzawa did not submit easily, and it fought repeatedly to remain outside Hittite control. Later traditions claimed that early Hittite rulers had subdued Arzawa, but these claims rest on formulaic language and retrospective interpretation. When examined closely, the texts do not describe conquest or administration. They speak instead of hostility, conflict, and unresolved rivalry. Military raids brought back livestock and captives, but there is no indication of permanent occupation or political domination. Even victories, if they occurred, left no lasting mark. Some narratives preserve anecdotal stories set in Arzawa, often moralizing in tone. They depict local figures engaged in personal rivalries, greed, or defiance. They cannot be read as evidence of formal Hittite rule. At most, they suggest a frontier society marked by shifting loyalties, opportunistic alliances, and individuals navigating the space between competing powers. In some copies of the Hittite laws, an unusual detail appears that has fueled a long argument about names and identities in Western Anatolia. In what is considered the older language version of the law code, the destination usually called Arzawa is written instead as the land of Luwian. If that spelling reflects real usage rather than a copying accident, it would suggest that during the Old Hittite period the Hittites sometimes referred to Arzawa by a different label. The law in question describes a scenario in which a person from Luwian abducts a man or a woman from Hattusa and takes the captive away to that western country. Yet the picture becomes messy the moment other versions of the same law are compared. Another copy uses Arzawa, where the earlier copy uses Luwian, and a third reduces the term even further. That pattern makes it difficult to treat the equation Arzawa equals Luwian as a firm historical fact. A far simpler explanation sits on the table. The scribe may have slipped into writing Lui or Luwian because the kidnapper is described as Luwian, not because the destination was genuinely called that. This matters because a broader contradiction immediately appears. If Arzawa truly carried the official name Luwia, it would be reasonable to expect the term to show up consistently in major historical narratives, especially in the earliest royal accounts. Yet in the foundational texts associated with early kings, the country is not called Luwia in any regular meaningful way. That silence raises the possibility that later arguments built on the law code spelling have been asked to carry far more weight than they can bear. Still, despite the inconsistency and despite the possibility of a simple clerical mistake, some modern reconstructions treat that single variation as if it were a key that unlocks the ethnic and linguistic identity of an enormous region. From that one fragile hinge, sweeping conclusions have been constructed. In the most extreme versions, the people of all the Arzawa lands are presented as if they were a single Luwian population, speaking one language across a wide and diverse landscape. This is often stated as though it were obvious, even though direct evidence for the ethnic composition of those communities is thin. At the same time, the historical reality preserved in the texts is full of warfare, raids, forced removals, captives, and deep hostility between the Hittite state and those Western powers. If Arzawa had truly been nothing more than a close sister people to the Hittites, speaking a nearly identical language and sharing the same background, the scale and bitterness of that long confrontation would demand a stronger explanation than modern slogans usually provide. The same line of reasoning has been expanded far beyond Arzawa itself. Some theories push the Luwian footprint from the Euphrates region all the way across central and western Anatolia, claiming that the inhabitants of many different zones spoke Luwian as a common language. From there, a second claim often follows. After the Hittite state collapsed around the end of the Bronze Age, the old traditions did not truly disappear. Instead, they supposedly continued under a Luwian banner, as if one great torch went out only for another to be lit in its place. To support this idea of continuity, attention is sometimes drawn to later Greek epic poetry, where traces of Anatolian place names and cultural motifs can indeed be found. In these readings, the epics are treated not merely as Greek stories with foreign scenery, but as narratives that preserve an Anatolian world alongside the Aegean one, with the native side identified specifically as Luwian. From there, the argument occasionally becomes even more ambitious. Some reconstructions imply that the flow of Near Eastern cultural knowledge into the Greek world did not primarily travel by sea under Phoenician influence, but moved across Anatolia through Indo-European speaking communities. In the most far-reaching versions, even the spread of alphabetic writing is pulled into this story, with the claim that the decisive transmitters were not Semitic seafarers, but Anatolian Indo-European groups. Critics point out an obvious difficulty here. Communities that used complex hieroglyphic systems and did not normally write in alphabetic scripts would be unlikely candidates to teach an alphabet they did not themselves employ in the same way. The problem is not only historical, but practical. It requires a chain of transmission that looks persuasive in ideology, but weak in mechanism. Behind this debate sits a more basic caution. Linguistic kinship does not automatically produce political unity, cultural sameness, or an empire-wide language zone. Luwian was related to Hittite, and that family resemblance makes it tempting to imagine broad areas speaking one tongue. Yet Anatolia's geography is fragmented, and its communities were often sharply local in their identities. Outside much later periods, the idea of a single language stretching unbroken from the Euphrates to the northwest Aegean runs against what is known about how the peninsula typically functioned. Even the simplest requirement, drawing a clear linguistic map for the pre-Greek centuries, remains out of reach because the evidence is still incomplete. The label Land of Luwia, in fact, does not behave like a stable political or geographic unit, The Hittite laws offer only a thin clue. One section sets different reward payments, depending on whether a runaway is captured on one side of the Great River Bend or beyond it. The difference implies that Luwian lay at a considerable distance outside that central zone. But the text does not indicate direction. It signals farther away, nothing more. The result is not a clear homeland, but a vague horizon. When the narrative moves forward in time, the record becomes uneven. For one major reign, Arzawa seems to disappear from view entirely. A broken group of texts preserves a fragmentary military scene in which an unnamed figure travels into Arzawa, attacks a chain of towns, and leaves behind many dead, including high-ranking commanders. Some place names in the list have been interpreted as Western Anatolian, yet the broader context is crowded with Hurrian personal names and references to Hurrian troops. That opens another possibility. The fighting described may not be a Hittite royal campaign at all. It could reflect conflicts involving other forces moving through the same landscape, with the Hittites only indirectly present in the surviving record. A later royal proclamation finally mentions Arzawa again, but even that notice is often misunderstood. The wording suggests hostility and conflict, not a clear rebellion by a subject province. Given the instability and internal struggles of the period, it is plausible that the Hittite center lacked the capacity to impose lasting order on distant enemies, especially in regions that were never fully integrated. After that point, the old Hittite documents largely fall silent on Western Anatolia. Even a ruler known for documenting political organization does not list any Western cities among the administrative centers where official stores and sealing institutions were established. Instead, the nearest relevant zones appear only as adjacent borderlands. In the generations that follow, references to Arzawa return, but in scattered, difficult pieces that are hard to date and even harder to assign to specific kings who share the same names. This confusion is not a minor technicality. Several rulers carried identical royal names, and different bodies of evidence must be distributed between them, like fragments of a torn map. The uncertainty makes reconstruction fragile, and a single newly published letter could shift the balance of the entire timeline. Even so, a broad outline emerges. During one of these contested reigns, Western enemies are described as exploiting a moment of transition at the Hittite court. Cities are listed as mobilizing, alliances forming, and pressure mounting on the Hittite heartland. Once the new ruler consolidates power, counter-campaigns follow. Yet the early results are not presented as clean conquests. Instead, the sources emphasize forced relocation. Populations driven out, captives taken, and people transported into central Anatolia, along with livestock and other spoils. Lists of prisoners include soldiers and chariot personnel, suggesting that the military infrastructure of those western lands was also being stripped away. Alongside the royal campaigns, certain commanders stand out in the record. Some are portrayed as effective occupiers, taking towns and returning with herds, captives, and labourers. One report even hints at brutality directed at civilians, including children, in a way that is rarely stated so openly in these sources. The details are broken, but the impression remains. The warfare was not only a contest of kings, it was violence inflicted on communities, and the texts preserve it without hesitation. Then, another turning point interrupts the western push. Pressure rises in central and southeastern regions, and the king is forced to abandon operations in the west and return to secure the core. Yet the western problem does not vanish. Plans form for a more decisive campaign, and the focus shifts toward a coalition known for assembling many cities under a single front. Modern interpretations have often tried to connect this coalition to Aegean powers, sometimes stretching the evidence too far. names in the coalition list have been seized upon because they resemble later Greek forms associated with the northwest, and this resemblance has encouraged bold identifications. But resemblance is not proof, and the temptation to force familiar classical labels onto Bronze Age geography has repeatedly distorted discussion. The king's own narrative presents the coalition campaign as a triumph achieved through speed, surprise movements, and new siege methods. The victory is described not only as a battlefield success, but as a massive transfer of people. Tens of thousands are said to be deported, including chariot fighters and prominent local figures. In the demographic realities of the time, such removals would not merely punish an enemy. They would hollow out the workforce and weaken the ability of the region to recover. Later, Greek writers describe strategies of cyclical destruction designed to ensure future harvests could be plundered again. Here, the logic seems harsher. Instead of leaving a population to rebuild for the next raid, the campaign aims to remove the population itself. A further twist follows. A local leader is bound by oath and installed, only to turn against the Hittite centre almost immediately. Another army is assembled, another confrontation unfolds, and the king claims that the enemy leader was delivered into his hands through divine favour, language that may conceal trickery, coercion, or an ambush, rather than a straightforward defeat. The sources do not explain the method. They only state the result. Around this cluster of events, modern scholarship has also built a separate debate about the name of the coalition and its relationship to the later word Asia. Some have argued that the coalition's name became the seed of a continental label. Others have looked for the same term in Egyptian records or in Aegean administrative documents. Yet these identifications face practical objections. Tribute lists described in Egyptian material include goods that are hard to source convincingly from a West Anatolian inland power. The wider the claim becomes, the more strained the economic and geographic logic appears. Several other pieces of evidence are often drawn into the picture. A damaged diplomatic letter seems to show disputes over islands and old occupations, pointing back to earlier conflicts involving the same western region. A bronze sword found near the gates of the Hittite capital carries a short dedicatory message linking a king's victory over the coalition to offerings made to a storm god. Whether the swords were captured as war booty or produced specifically for dedication cannot be proven, but the object fits the pattern of turning military success into ritual display. Other finds have also been claimed as echoes of these campaigns, including a gold vessel with a hieroglyphic inscription that resembles the language of conquest. Yet here too, caution returns, because the find spot is unknown, and the object's authenticity has been questioned. For many years, scholars argued over where to place a famous complaint document, often called the Madduwatta text, within the Hittite timeline. Setting it in the reign of Anawanda fits the wider sequence of events, even though the story itself looks back repeatedly to the previous generation and to the political atmosphere shaped under his father. The document does not read like a calm report. It sounds like a ruler laying out a case, describing favours granted, warnings ignored, and a pattern of betrayal that keeps returning in new forms. At the centre of the story stands Madduwatta, portrayed as a notable figure in Western Anatolia, wealthy, respected, and operating like a powerful local lord. The people under him are described as mobile, living in a tribal structure closer to pastoral migrants than to a settled city-state. Yet Madduwatta is trapped between greater forces. A war leader from across the sea, Hattusa, presses him relentlessly, treating him as prey rather than as a partner. Unable to hold out, Madduwatta abandons his own ground and flees east into Hittite territory to seek protection from the Great King. The Hittite court receives him with strategic warmth. The narrative emphasizes that Madduwatta is not merely allowed to survive. He is rescued in a way meant to bind him morally and politically. His household is sheltered, his followers are granted safety, farmland is assigned so they can feed themselves, and provisions are provided to help them restart life under Hittite oversight. The text insists that without this intervention they would have faced starvation and humiliation. That language is more than pity. It is a political message. It frames the Hittite king as the one who gives life, land, and legitimacy, expecting obedience in return. The price of that rescue is loyalty. Madduwatta is made to swear allegiance and is told directly that his future belongs to the Hittite king and to Hatti. Territory is placed under his administration, districts associated with mountains and river lands on the western edge of Hittite influence. A second region is assigned as his fixed base, closer to the frontier than to the deep west. The logic is clear. A man whose character is uncertain is settled where his movements can be watched, where he remains useful as a buffer, and where escape into richer western lands is not effortless. Madduwatta, however, does not accept this arrangement as a final settlement. The text paints him as restless and calculating. He complains that the assigned region is rugged and unproductive, using the harshness of the land as an excuse to resist planting roots. What he truly wants is not confinement near the Hittite border, but open access to fertile lowlands and broad grazing zones. For a time he appears to endure the situation quietly, yet the narration implies that even during this period, he is searching for a way out, testing the limits, building contacts, and preparing for a larger leap. Then, abruptly, the picture changes. Madduwatta is no longer merely a frontier client. He appears as a major power in western Anatolia, linked to a much wider sphere that includes important Arzawa lands. This transformation is not described as a legitimate promotion from the Hittite court. It looks like the result of maneuvering, deals, opportunism, and the exploitation of confusion on the Hittite side. Earlier oaths about mutual assistance and the duty to report hostile talk to the king become meaningless. The man who was saved now behaves as though he owes nothing. He begins to act independently, turning the frontier role into a springboard for expansion. A critical moment comes when Madduwatta launches a war without authorization against another major regional figure, an enemy also associated with Hittite concerns. It can be imagined how he might justify it later, perhaps by claiming he was enforcing alliance obligations. Yet the narrative suggests another motive: the desire to present himself as the single dominant ruler of the western lands. The campaign fails disastrously. His army collapses, he escapes alone, and his family and property fall into enemy hands. It is a personal humiliation, the kind that would normally destroy a lesser lord. The Hittite king learns of this only after the damage is done. The response is anger mixed with calculation. Despite outrage at Madduwatta's unauthorized war, the Hittite side still sends a force to help him, because abandoning him would hand influence to the rival and weaken the frontier. A commander arrives, rescues Madduwatta's wife and children, and restores him to his position. The story could have ended there as a lesson in dependence. Instead, it becomes a case study in repeated double-dealing. Soon another danger appears. Hattusa returns as a threat. A Hittite general moves in again to assist. The Hittite troops take positions in a mountainous zone and prepare for battle. That is the moment Madduwatta chooses to switch sides. Rather than supporting the Hittite force that came to save him, he incites local populations against it, framing the Hittites as occupiers and outsiders. His agitation spreads in key communities, and it is paired with practical guidance. He provides routes and plans that exploit the Hittite army's unfamiliarity with the terrain. The result is an ambush. The Hittite troops are cut off, their commanders are killed, and the intervention collapses. After this, the narrative becomes even more provocative. Madduwatta signs peace with a former enemy and seals the arrangement through marriage ties, giving his daughter into that rival's family. Whether this alliance is presented as a forced necessity or as calculated opportunism, the effect is the same. It mocks the Hittite king's authority. When the Hittite court protests, Madduwatta answers with a story designed to soothe and distract. He claims the friendship is only a temporary trick, a way to win trust and later destroy the rival unexpectedly. The document does not reveal whether the Hittite king believes this explanation. It only shows the pattern. Madduwatta lies when it suits him, promises future loyalty when cornered, and returns to expansion as soon as the pressure eases. A frustrating gap follows because portions of the text break off and the next stages are partially obscured. Even so, the surviving threads suggest that the turmoil surrounding a change of ruler at Hattusa created space for Madduwatta's continued hostility. Under the new king, his schemes do not end. The impression is of a central authority struggling to keep control while a frontier strongman keeps exploiting every distraction. At one point, the tone shifts into something close to resignation, as if the Hittite ruler realizes that this man's deception cannot be cured by warnings and favors. Madduwatta then expands openly into cities claimed by Hatti. He occupies them, blocks tribute payments to the Hittite king, refuses to grant passage rights to Hittite forces, and ends the practice of returning refugees. He encourages neighboring populations to rise against Hittite influence. A western land that had remained outside his grasp becomes the next target. When it attacks Hittite interests, the Hittite king demands that Madduwatta deal with it on Hatti's behalf. Strangely, he does. He marches, attacks, and occupies, then refuses to hand the land back. The act looks like cooperation on the surface and theft underneath. A protest follows from Hattusa demanding immediate restitution. Madduwatta appears to accept the demand in words, yet does not abandon the broader network of conquests. The ambition grows beyond the interior. He strikes toward coastal regions and begins preparing a maritime base, suggesting a desire to project power outward, even toward islands. The Hittite king answers with a explains-it-all claim that does not match the practical realities, a declaration that distant island lands fall under Hittite ownership. It sounds like a political fiction, an assertion meant to intimidate and limit Madduwatta's reach, rather than a statement grounded in actual naval control. Yet the surviving narrative ends before it reveals how the confrontation resolves. The last impression is one of unfinished crisis, a frontier opportunist growing bold, while the central state tries to contain him with threats, protests, and fragile leverage. Alongside that story of betrayal and frontier politics, another set of rare windows opens onto Arzawa's position in the wider international world. 2 letters found in Egypt preserve a correspondence between the Egyptian court and an Arzawa king named Tarhundaradu. These documents are remarkable not only because Arzawa appears by name, but because they show a Western Anatolian ruler negotiating marriage into the highest royal sphere. Tarhundaradu's letter is lengthy and strategic. He seeks a formal response, asks that messages be written in the language he considers appropriate, and treats the relationship as a serious diplomatic project. The Egyptian reply, more procedural in tone, speaks about handing the princess to an envoy, performing a symbolic ceremony to mark the marriage's acceptance, and arranging gifts and people to accompany her. One detail stands out sharply: a request involving the casca. The letters do not explain why these people are mentioned, leaving the motive uncertain. They may be servants, captives, or political signals. The same atmosphere of instability appears in another phrase that suggests Hatti is fractured or disrupted. If the centre is weakened, it makes sense that external powers would probe for influence, alliances, and leverage. That wider context also fits other reports in which Arzawan forces push deep into zones far from the Aegean, reaching towns on the central southern routes. In such a climate, Arzawa is not a distant name on the edge of the world. It is an active player pressing into contested spaces, while Hittite authority struggles to hold its structure together. From that same shadowy period comes the hint of a crucial letter found in a Hittite provincial archive, written by a high official to an unnamed king. In its surviving lines, the message describes multiple Western leaders gathering for a siege and lists allies assembling from several directions. The tone is urgent. It reads like intelligence reporting during a crisis, naming men who appear repeatedly in the political storms of Western Anatolia. The implication is that Arzawa and its neighbouring powers are not isolated pockets. They form shifting coalitions, drawing in war leaders and local rulers who can suddenly converge on strategic towns. The full significance of the letter remains uncertain because key portions are missing, and some identifications depend on readings that could change. Even so, it strengthens the sense that this era is defined by motion, sieges, alliances, defections, and rapid shifts in loyalty. After this turbulent middle phase, the record begins to thicken under a later king, Suppiluliuma. The information becomes more continuous and more detailed, suggesting a state that has recovered enough strength to campaign systematically and record events with greater confidence. Early in his reign, Suppiluliuma appears focused on clearing enemies who had penetrated deep into Anatolia. Certain place names point not to the Aegean coast, but to inland corridors and mountain zones that serve as staging grounds for raiders. The fighting is described in familiar royal language: enemies struck down, bodies counted, positions seized. A key feature of the narrative is mobility: marches by night, sudden assaults and pressure on mountain strongholds. In one sequence, a Hittite commander attacks enemy positions tied to a mountain base, then pushes toward a major town set on elevated ground and lays siege to it. The king's own movements follow, shifting between camps and strategic points, suggesting a coordinated effort to stabilize the interior routes before turning westward. Once the immediate threat is contained, the pathway toward Arzawa opens more fully. Another sequence then shows the fragile loyalty of buffer zones. Men who had been resettled or attached to Hittite service abandon their obligations and return to Arzawa's side. Frontier towns waver. The Hittite king demands the return of people he considers his subjects. The refusal triggers a counterattack. A Hittite commander takes a town only to be defeated by an Arzawan leader. An unusually candid admission in Hittite-style narrative tradition, where defeats are normally glossed over or reshaped. That defeat prompts direct royal intervention. Suppiluliuma gathers troops and moves west, pushing toward the region later associated with Mira. Here, geography and identification become complicated, because Western Anatolia is a mosaic of valleys, passes, and local centres whose names are difficult to anchor securely. Yet later discoveries and rereadings in the region have encouraged a stronger placement of certain Western kingdoms around major passes and valleys. A rock relief near a strategic pass, long known but hard to read, has been interpreted anew, with a royal name now recognised more clearly. A set of seals found in the Hittite capital also points to the same figure as an important Western ruler, suggesting that these kingdoms were integrated into Hittite diplomatic and administrative networks, at least at certain moments. This has led to proposals that the core of Mira lay around the zone near the pass, connecting river valleys and controlling movement between regions. Related suggestions place other neighbouring lands in nearby river systems, and even propose that a major western capital could be located at a site later famous in Greek history. Archaeology has offered hints, walls, and pottery that could fit the general period, yet the evidence has not reached the level where it forces agreement. Still, the direction of thought is clear. Western Hittite-era geography is being redrawn not by a single dramatic proof, but by layered clues, reliefs, seals, inscriptions, and the logic of terrain. Other finds add texture. High in rugged mountains near a lake, scattered clusters of hieroglyphic markings have been recorded. They do not form a smooth, continuous text. They appear more like separate signatures or short statements left in multiple locations. Even so, they are treated as indicators that writing practices associated with Luwian hieroglyphs were present in the wider Western landscape. Some readings even suggest that a shortened royal name appears there, potentially linked to a Mira ruler, connected by adoption to Hittite royal circles. If that interpretation holds, it would show not only political interaction but a cultural overlap. Western elites, leaving marks in a script tied to Anatolian traditions. Returning to the campaign narrative, Suppiluliuma's operations include mountain sieges where enemy leaders escape, flee into neighbouring lands, and trigger chariot pursuits. The results are sometimes unclear because the texts break at crucial moments. Yet the pattern is consistent. Pressure applied to strongholds, enemy flight, pursuit, and the forced transfer of captives back to the Hittite core. After major actions, the king moves through known garrison towns and strengthens defensive positions, treating the frontier as a system of gates that must be fortified to stop repeated incursions. In parallel, Hittite commanders strike at specific western lands that resist or threaten the border. One campaign is described as causing a town to surrender out of fear, followed by an assault in which a region is burned and looted. Spoils are carried back east. Another political strand emerges through treaties and oaths. Certain Arzawan leaders are presented as having been bound by sworn obligations, only to violate them when opportunity returns. The texts underline a repeated theme: oaths broken, loyalties reversed, and the Hittite king forced again and again to rebuild control through a mixture of force, agreements, and strategic gifts. A strange royal letter sits at the edge of the Hittite record, and it still refuses to give up its secrets. The sender is a king named Tudhalia, yet which Tudhalia remains uncertain. The recipient is a queen whose identity is just as unclear. For a long time, the easiest solution was to place the text late in Hittite history and link it to famous figures from the empire's final century. That older reading treated the letter as a personal message from a late Tudhalia to a well-known queen, and it tried to match a named official inside the letter with men known from later treaties. Over time, however, the balance of evidence shifted. Increasingly, the letter began to look like it belonged to an earlier age, closer to the reign of Suppiluliuma, when the Hittite state was expanding, rearranging western Anatolia, and navigating constant betrayal along its borders. In that framework, the Tudhalia of the letter is no longer an imperial monarch at the end of the story, but a younger figure caught inside the ambitions and power struggles of Suppiluliuma's circle. The queen, in that scenario, is not the famous late empress, but one of Suppiluliuma's wives, drawn into a delicate conflict as an intermediary. The tone of the letter is almost uncomfortable in its humility. The king does not write like a ruler issuing commands. He writes like someone who feels he has crossed a line and cannot find a clean way back. He repeatedly circles around the same point. He has offended his lord, a superior whose health he anxiously asks about. The writer insists again and again that the offence was not deliberate, yet he never names what he actually did. That silence is the letter's most revealing feature. It suggests a political mistake that could not be admitted openly, perhaps because it involved loyalty, succession, or an internal dispute that was too dangerous to describe on a tablet. Instead of facing the superior directly, the writer seems to lean on the queen. The message reads as if it is begging her to soften the blow, to carry words that the writer himself is ashamed to deliver. On the reverse side, the letter shifts from private embarrassment to the harsh reality of power in the provinces. It mentions a military commander who accompanies the king on campaigns in the lower land. It also describes a pattern that repeats constantly in Hittite frontier politics. Towns break loyalty the moment they sense weakness, then return to obedience as soon as strength reappears. In one chilling sequence, the message describes opportunists reacting to a ruler's illness. As soon as the news spreads that the lord is unwell at Ankuwa, people detach themselves and turn away. When they hear he has recovered, they rush back to him. When they hear he is gone, they break away again. The passage looks like a snapshot of a state held together not by affection, but by fear and calculation. The words are simple, yet the implication is brutal. Loyalty is a weather pattern, changing with rumour. That same passage also creates a historical puzzle. If the superior in the letter is Suppiluliuma, then the line about hearing of his disappearance becomes loaded. It is not easy to treat it as a direct announcement of his death, because that would force the chronology into awkward corners. It would also raise the question of when Suppiluliuma eliminated the young Tudalia, if the writer truly is that figure. The ambiguity is hard to escape. Either the phrase does not mean what it seems to mean, or the identities must be handled with caution, or the letter belongs to a different political context than the most tempting reconstruction. The text does not resolve this problem, it simply exposes it. While such letters hint at tense conversations inside the royal household, other records show the same instability playing out across western Anatolia. In the time of Suppiluliuma, the ruler of Mira named Mashturi, or at least a leading figure later associated with Mira, appears in the tradition as someone driven out by his own relatives. He escapes with nothing but his life and makes the long journey east to the Hittite capital. The Hittite version presents him as a victim rescued by the great king. Yet that narrative should be read carefully. Hittite royal writing often turns political convenience into moral drama. A displaced prince becomes proof of the king's generosity, and that generosity becomes a chain. Suppiluliuma treats the exile well, binds him and his family to the Hittite cause, and even seals the relationship through marriage into the royal line. The message is unmistakable. Survival and restoration come with conditions. Yet even this arrangement carries a sense of unfinished business. Suppiluliuma is frequently described as absent in the Hurrian lands during critical stretches, too busy fighting in the east to manage his western clients closely. That gap mattered. When central attention drifts, western loyalties drift with it. The records also suggest that the marriage did not produce an heir, which could only intensify uncertainty around status and succession. It is not even fully clear whether the displaced figure was already king when he fled, or merely a prince with a claim. Later documents imply that Mira and the neighbouring land of Kawalia were returned to him with his household and his seat of power, which points toward royal standing or something close to it. Even so, his lineage and his original right to rule remain frustratingly obscure. Another Western relationship appears through a treaty tied to Wilusa. Its damaged lines still carry a broad message. Wilusa's king remains loyal during the storms of the Arzawa Wars. That loyalty matters because it shows that Arzawa was not a single block. By this stage, the West appears broken into several named lands: Mira, Hapala, Wilusa, and the Seha Riverland, each with its own leadership and its own angle of survival. Whether this fragmentation grew mainly from Hittite strategy or from local realities is hard to prove. It is also unclear whether the Hittites used Arzawa as a label for one kingdom or as a flexible name for a whole region. The sources do not speak with one clear voice, and that silence is part of the story. Then the narrative moves into a new phase, driven by a younger king who inherits a kingdom under pressure. When Mursili becomes ruler after his father's death, he is still a boy, and the world around him senses it immediately. Rival powers and hostile neighbours watch him closely, some mocking him, others testing the borders. The timing is cruel. A plague has been draining the land, weakening manpower and resources. Even experienced commanders die unexpectedly. One leading general, someone whose knowledge of Western campaigning would have been priceless, vanishes from the stage at exactly the wrong moment. Whether he fell to disease or to other causes is less important than the effect. A child king is left, without a proven hand to guide the first critical years. Mursili's response begins not with a march, but with ritual and fear. Before striking back, he seeks strength from the divine centre of Hatti. He goes to the sun goddess of Arina and frames the war as more than politics. Attacks on Hatti are also insults to the gods, and the gods must be asked to judge the case. The list of enemies surrounding Hatti is long. Powerful states to the east and south, raiders from the north, restless regions and frontier peoples on every side. The pressure forms a ring. Choosing where to strike first becomes its own crisis. For a time, patience is forced on him. Preparations must be made, troops placed, and garrisons reinforced, while the king absorbs insults and waits for a moment when action is possible. By the third year, the Western Front can no longer be postponed. Arzawa's ruler, Uhaziti, is portrayed as sharp-minded and quick to exploit weakness. Rather than waiting for the Hittite response, he moves early, coordinates with overseas powers, and seizes key positions, pushing the border threat deeper than Hatti can tolerate. Mursili, tied down elsewhere, sends generals to meet the danger. Western Anatolia at this time appears as a world of shifting masks. Clients who remain loyal only until a better offer appears. Local rulers who treat treaties as temporary shelter, and great powers that reward betrayal when it suits their aims. The Hittite state is not innocent in this game either. It has its own methods of dividing rivals, sponsoring claimants, and reshaping the political map to keep the West unstable enough to manage. Amid this chaos, one Western figure remains tied to Hatti, at least for the moment. The restored ruler of Mira stays in the Hittite orbit and even declares war on a common enemy. He takes territory with Hittite support. The exact timing of his return from exile is unclear, yet the shape of the strategy is recognizable. The Hittites prefer a Western partner who owes everything to them. Meanwhile, inside Arzawa itself, the struggle shifts to the next generation. Uhaziti's son becomes the field commander facing Hittite pressure, and other sons hover in the background, ready to inherit either a crown or a catastrophe. Mursili speaks to his client in the familiar language of control, promising restoration, emphasizing favors, soothing ambition, keeping him dependent, while war unfolds. Once the campaigning begins in earnest, the journey into the West becomes its own ordeal, shaped by terrain, distance, and the psychology of omens. the Hittite army moves along a long inland route toward valleys and passes that open toward the Aegean. During the march, a terrifying phenomenon appears in the sky, described like a blazing object moving across the heavens. In a world where signs are taken seriously, the army cannot simply ignore such a thing. The interpretation matters. Priests must be consulted, meanings weighed, and the king's own body reacts violently to fear. The tradition claims that Mursili suffers a lasting facial paralysis from the shock. Modern eyes might see something more natural behind the drama. Volcanic activity in the region, flames and smoke from cones and fissures, the strange glow of an active landscape. Yet whether the cause was cosmic or earthly, the effect is historical. Both sides are shaken. Uhazziti also collapses into illness, and the war takes on the quality of a struggle conducted under an anxious sky. Even with the king unwell, the campaign continues. Reinforcements link up, allies join, and the army turns toward Arzawa's heart. A major clash occurs near a river by the territory of Walma. Uhazziti's son leads troops and chariots into battle, and Mursili claims victory with divine support. The defeated force is driven back, and the Hittite army pushes deeper into enemy country. The news reaches the sick Uhazziti, who no longer has the strength to hold his capital. He flees by boat to an island offshore, taking members of his household and his sons with him. The Hittites enter Apasa without meeting a serious defence. Yet triumph brings its own problems. The march has been long, the season is turning, and the return route back east will soon be threatened by rain, swollen rivers, and snow in the highlands. Exhaustion sits over the army, but discipline is never perfect after victory. Soldiers begin to loot. Panic spreads among civilians unable to escape with the king. Many flee toward a steep mountain mass that runs into the sea like a wall, a landscape so rugged that chariots cannot climb it. Others retreat into a nearby fortified settlement, hoping height will protect what remains. Among the refugees are people originally from lands claimed by Hatti, individuals whom Mursili demanded, back earlier as a pretext for war. Their presence among the fugitives becomes another piece of the political puzzle. Western conflicts are never purely local, because populations and obligations have been dragged across borders for years. The king follows the fleeing masses into that harsh terrain. The mountain slopes are thick with brush and rock, paths narrow and exhausting. The tradition describes him climbing on foot at the head of his men, pushing upward into a place where escape seems impossible. From the summit, the sea and the islands are visible, confusing the eye and the sense of distance. The narrative gives the impression of a ruler who has physically seen the landscape, not merely heard about it. The siege becomes one of endurance. The fugitives are forced into hunger and thirst until they finally surrender, begging to be taken as captives rather than left to die in the wild. The numbers recorded after these operations are staggering. Tens of thousands of captives are counted in some versions of the tradition, while other texts push the totals even higher. Whatever the exact figure, the scale matters. It implies a massive drain of human labour from the west into the Hittite heartland. Such forced movement would reshape economies, agriculture, and local defence for years. It also reveals the real nature of the conquest. This is not simply a change of flags, it is a transfer of people. Time pressure eventually forces a retreat from one objective. A settlement refuses an ultimatum. Yet the king cannot afford to become trapped by the coming season. Instead, he establishes winter quarters in the region, holding ground so the enemy cannot simply return. During that winter, Uhazziti dies in exile on his island. For Mursili, it is welcome news, but it does not end the war. The dead king's sons remain, divided in their choices. One returns to the mainland to defend what can still be defended. Another remains on the island, fading from the record. A third will later become far more significant, stepping into the role that his father's death left open. With the arrival of the next campaign season, Mursili acts quickly. He performs a brief religious festival without returning home, suggesting urgency and a desire to secure divine favour without losing time. Then he returns to the siege of Puranda. The defence is led by one of Uhaziti's sons, a man who makes a fatal strategic decision. Instead of relying on the city's high position, he comes down into open ground to face the Hittites, perhaps because the walls are inadequate, or because he believes a field battle offers a better chance. The result is defeat. He is driven back into the city, the Hittites surround it, and water access is cut. Under cover of darkness, the defender escapes with his closest circle, leaving others behind. The city falls to looting, and new captives are counted by the thousands, again without even including the prisoners taken privately by officers and soldiers. After these successes, attention turns northward, toward the Sehar Riverland and its ruler Manapa Tahunda. The story presented in Hittite sources is familiar. A ruler who once owed his survival to Hatti becomes ungrateful, and shifts allegiance when it seems profitable. When the Hittite king approaches, that same ruler suddenly remembers caution. He sends envoys, begs forgiveness, pleads loyalty. When pleading fails, he sends his own mother, leading a delegation of elders. This time, the appeal works. The king accepts the submission, a decision later writers sometimes portray as tenderness, especially because an older woman plays a role in the outcome. Yet the wider behaviour of the campaign makes the label of softness hard to sustain. This is a ruler who burns towns, starves populations into surrender, and relocates mass numbers of people. Mercy here looks less like sentiment and more like calculation. Submission without battle saves time, preserves manpower, and keeps the momentum moving. With the West increasingly under control, Mursili fortifies key cities, installs occupation forces, and creates a system that can hold newly conquered lands. He does not simply leave a client ruler in place and trust him. A guard force is attached to the Western allies' household, serving as protection and as surveillance. The king's distrust deepens, shaped by repeated betrayals. The region is treated as dangerous even after peace is declared. The outcome of 2 continuous years of war is summarized in a cold administrative style. Western lands are assigned to specific rulers, each now bound to provide soldiers regularly. The West is no longer a cluster of independent powers. It has been turned into a network of subordinate states that must feed manpower into the Hittite war machine. The formal treaties that follow are the legal skin over a military reality. Some rulers are recognized with royal titles only after they are firmly bound. Others are treated as lesser figures, clients who receive authority without the dignity of being called kings. This difference is not accidental. Titles become tools, handed out when useful and withheld when trust is lacking. The long and troubled story of Mashturi, or Mashtwilua, in another form of the tradition, shows the limits of the system. For a time he is the Hittite court's most valuable Western partner, linked by marriage, placed on a throne, used as an anchor in the region. Yet he also becomes a liability. He is accused of stirring revolt, failing to deliver intelligence, and forming suspicious friendships with dangerous figures whose identity remains unclear. When summoned, he refuses to appear and flees to another land. The Hittite king responds with force, strikes that land, and demands his return. The frightened locals capture him and hand him over. What happens next is grim. The tradition suggests he is taken back to Hatti and killed. Later generations, perhaps uneasy about the justice of the act, perform rituals aimed at calming the spirit of someone believed to have been executed wrongly. The political record thus turns into something almost like a moral echo. Conquest produces guilt as well as power. After his fall, power in Mira is transferred to an adopted heir, Kupanta Kurunta, and a new treaty warns him not to repeat his predecessor's betrayal. Borders are defined, rivers named, forbidden zones listed, and restrictions imposed. Even access to certain towns is prohibited, not because the ruler lacks ambition, but because the Hittites understand ambition too well. The West has to be fenced in, watched, and managed continuously. Around this central arrangement, other rulers remain in place across the former Arzawa sphere. A leader in Hapala, a king in Wilusa, a ruler in the Sehar Riverland, influential men associate with coastal zones, and figures whose names surface in letters as partners in coalitions or enemies in motion. Some of these names may hide more than one person, because the timeline is messy and the sources are incomplete. Later discoveries even threaten to overturn established reconstructions, forcing historians to consider that a name might belong to different individuals in different decades. The West, in other words, is not merely difficult because of geography. It is difficult because power there changes hands rapidly, alliances flip without warning, and the record survives only in fragments. Across Western Anatolia, the Hittite Empire did not rule only through armies and sieges. It also ruled through paperwork, formal vassal treaties that followed a recognizable pattern. These agreements were not written as casual promises. They were built like templates, designed to turn messy frontier politics into predictable obligations. The opening typically set the tone, establishing who was speaking and why the text existed. After that came a rehearsed story of the past. Earlier conflicts, shifting loyalties, old favours granted by the Hittite court, and the reasons the local ruler now owed obedience. Only then did the treaty move into its real purpose, a long set of rules that defined borders, behaviour, and punishment. The borders mattered first. The local ruler was expected to protect the lands assigned to him and to keep the Hittite frontiers safe from damage. Protection was not limited to territory. Loyalty was personal and dynastic. The vassal was bound to defend the great king and his family, and those same duties extended to the vassal's own household. In this legal language, breaking obligations was the same thing as breaking oaths. A vassal who drifted away from the great king's side, who switched allegiance, or who sheltered fugitives became, by definition, an oath-breaker. That label did not describe a moral failure only. It created a legal excuse for war. Refusing to return refugees, hiding political enemies, or allowing defectors to settle safely inside the vassal's land could be treated as an open challenge to Hittite authority. The treaties also tried to manage the most unstable element on the western frontier: rumour and rebellion. If hostility toward the great king appeared anywhere, inside Hatti or beyond it, the vassal was expected to respond like an early warning system. At times, he would be asked to send auxiliary troops. In special cases, he would be required to lead them in person, proving loyalty not with words, but with risk. The agreements laid out the conditions under which these auxiliary forces would be supplied, and they insisted that intelligence must travel quickly. Reports about conspiracies, unrest, and shifting alliances were to be delivered without delay. The vassal was also responsible for Hittite garrison troops stationed in his territory. These soldiers were not simply guests. They were instruments of control, and the treaty demanded that they be fed and cared for properly. Another recurring theme was distrust of noise. The the political chatter that thrives in unstable regions. The vassal was warned not to believe stories supposedly coming from Hatti, and not to panic when accusations or gossip spread. The official expectation was patience and trust. The vassal should assume the great king remained reliable, wait for events to become clear, and avoid rash moves. At the same time, the treaty demanded the opposite kind of speed when the talk turned into propaganda against Hatti. Any slander or hostile accusation had to be reported at once. The goal was obvious: control the flow of information, prevent local rulers from using rumour as an excuse to defect, and ensure that the imperial court heard about threats before they grew. Fugitives appear again and again in this legal world. The rule was simple on paper. Anyone fleeing from Hatti into a vassal's territory was to be handed over immediately. The system, however, included sharp exceptions that reveal how power worked in practice. The Hittites did not promise to return every runaway who fled in the other direction. Ordinary escapees might be kept, while skilled specialists and people tied to conspiracies were more likely to be sent back. The treaties also anticipated disorder inside vassal lands. If rebellion broke out, the great king presented himself as a guarantor of stability, promising support to suppress uprisings. At the same time, the vassals were ordered to hold together as a bloc. They were told to remain loyal to one another and act in solidarity, a clear attempt to prevent one client state from being used against another. The agreements even regulated the movement of enemies. A vassal was not supposed to let hostile armies pass through his territory. He was also forbidden to misuse Hittite help. Auxiliary forces received from Hatti could not be handed over to an enemy, nor diverted for private ambitions. The treaties reached into the details of forced labour too. Captives brought to Hatti during earlier campaigns, especially those taken in the Great Western Wars, were to be returned if they escaped. The Empire expected the West to function as a net, catching people who slipped loose. All of this was framed with ritual pressure. The treaty text was meant to be read aloud periodically so that it could not be forgotten. Divine witnesses were summoned as guarantors. In the Hittite world, the gods were not decoration at the end of a document. They were enforcement. Oaths had weight because breaking them was believed to trigger divine punishment as well as imperial retaliation. That combination, religion plus threat, was the backbone of the system. When the story moves forward into the reign of Mu'tali, the clearest window onto western Anatolia comes through his state treaty with the ruler of Wilusa, a man named Alaksandu. The surviving text begins with a historical preface, yet it is badly damaged and, even where it is readable, it follows the familiar style of official memory. Such prefaces often smooth over conflict, exaggerate harmony, and present the relationship as more stable than it truly was. The result is a problem for any neutral reading. The introduction is less a transparent record than an ideological performance. It wants to show continuity, legitimacy, and mutual goodwill, even in places where the political reality was likely far harsher. One claim often associated with these narratives is that earlier, Hittite kings avoided attacking Wilusa during their western campaigns because Wilusa remained loyal. If this idea reflects more than propaganda, it suggests Wilusa was positioned in a way that made loyalty strategically sensible, close enough to the Hittite core to fear direct punishment, yet placed so that armies marching to the main western battlefields did not necessarily have to cross its territory. The geography becomes a battlefield of interpretation. If Wilusa lay directly on the main corridor of campaigns, its loyalty would require one set of explanations. If it lay off the main axis, loyalty could be explained by different pressures. proximity to Hatti, dependence on Hittite protection, or vulnerability to regional rivals. In this view, the popular habit of matching Wilusa automatically with the famous city of the northwest becomes less convincing. The Hittite record does not show Wilusa being conquered in the same way Arzawa lands were. That absence does not prove anything on its own, yet it fits a picture in which Wilusa occupied a different position, politically and geographically, than the states that were shattered and rebuilt under direct Hittite force. Alexander himself is also difficult to pin down. The sources hint at adoption or an unusual succession, but they do not provide a firm genealogy. Even the reason for Muwatalli's treaty is unclear. Hittite practice suggests a treaty might follow conquest, a new peace settlement, or a change on a local throne. The text offers clues that military action preceded the agreement. It contains a note that the Hittite king came to Alexander's aid and struck down an enemy. Another report, from a separate message tradition, seems to describe troops moving against Wilusa, yet the identity of the commander and the nature of the attackers remain blurred. The enemy could have been a local rival, a foreign raider, or a coalition working through a proxy. The uncertainty matters because it shows what the West looked like. A space where violence could erupt quickly, and where even official archives preserve only fragments of what set a crisis in motion. The treaty also reveals a wider map of rulers still in place across the old Arzawa sphere. Several local kings are described as continuing in their territories. Some, perhaps long-established figures, rather than new appointees. Their names appear like markers of a new order. One in the Seha Riverland, another in Mira, another in Hapala. The text repeats a demand already familiar from earlier vassal contracts. These Western rulers must cooperate with each other and maintain solidarity. Among them, one ally appears to receive special attention, treated with extra care because of his connection to the royal family of Hatti. That detail shows how the empire mixed formal hierarchy with family politics. Blood ties did not replace the treaty system, but they shaped how the system was applied. At the same time, Western Anatolia remained vulnerable to a particular kind of troublemaker. The mobile warlord, the man who could not be contained by one city or one oath. A figure known for raiding, shifting sides, and operating under the shadow of overseas backing, becomes central in letters from this period. His story is not presented as a simple rebellion. It is described like a persistent infection, someone once tied to the Hittite sphere who breaks away, gains support from across the sea, and begins striking Hittite lands and client states. The Hittite king, in response, tries to solve the problem through diplomacy and pressure rather than endless campaigns. The letters portray negotiations, complaints, and demands for extradition. Yet they also show a hard truth. Western politics did not always respond to formal rules. A treaty could define the world as orderly, while reality kept behaving like chaos. The confusion deepens because these famous letters have been dated differently by different scholars, and the shifting chronologies change how the entire Western narrative is assembled. Some reconstructions place the letter set during Muwatalli's reign, before the royal capital's relocation. Others push it earlier or later, depending on which names are treated as fixed individuals and which might represent repeated or reused names across generations. New discoveries complicate matters further. Another letter from the same broad region, still not fully published, appears to mention a cluster of well-known Western actors together. If those people truly belong to an earlier period than previously assumed, then either the famous troublemaker's career stretched implausibly long, or there were multiple individuals with the same name, or the dating of one document must be moved. In this situation, certainty is a luxury. The most honest view is that the archive preserves overlapping snapshots, rather than one continuous film. After Alexandru disappears from the record, a later message tradition describes a crisis around Wilusa's throne. A king named Walmu appears as a ruler who is removed, taken away as a hostage, and held outside his kingdom. Another local ruler, possibly a vassal king from a neighbouring region, seems to have the power to restore him. The Hittite great king addresses this intermediary as "my son," a phrase that can imply youth, status, or political intimacy rather than literal parentage. The imperial message pushes hard for Walmu's return, revealing that Wilusa mattered enough for the great king to intervene personally. The letter even suggests a shared control arrangement, implying that Walmu's restoration would serve both the great king and the intermediary ruler. Whether Walmu ever regained the throne remains unknown. The letter ends with demands, not results, and the archive falls silent. Another important message, written by the ruler of the Sehar River land, presents a model vassal voice. The writer insists that he follows treaty terms precisely, monitors events closely, and sends intelligence immediately to his patron. His report includes alarming news. A Hittite general is moving troops, and Wilusa is being attacked. The same letter claims the vassal did not join the campaign because illness prevented him from fighting alongside the Hittite army. It also complains about being humiliated by the notorious raider and describes how that raider used allies and family ties to apply pressure. Raids reach islands, bands of soldiers or irregular fighters are mentioned, and the West again looks like a zone where violence and rumour travel faster than official order. From an outside observer's perspective, a pattern emerges. The raider becomes dangerous not only because he fights, but because he connects networks. He operates in contact with the overseas power, agitates inside the client states, and relies on a clever partner based in a coastal city who supports him in schemes and logistics. The letters paint them as collaborators who act as agents and local enablers for foreign interests. In this portrayal, Western Anatolia becomes a contested space of proxy influence, where the great king's authority is challenged not by a single rival kingdom, but by persistent interference, shifting alliances, and the ease with which coastal routes allow trouble to spread. After Muwatalli's period, the quantity of direct Western reporting seems to thin out. Later, Hittite texts only hint at Western affairs through scattered notices. A prince supporting one side in a Hittite civil conflict, a local ruler trying to influence foreign courts, a king complaining about Western lands, or a ritual text that assumes war with Western enemies. Even these fragments are revealing. They show that Western rulers could play double games, appearing obedient while exploring alternatives. A striking example comes from correspondence involving Egypt, where a Western king's position suggests a willingness to intervene in imperial politics, beyond his proper place. The Egyptian response, cautious and diplomatic, appears to reject the request, perhaps to preserve the larger peace. The fact that a copy of such correspondence ended up in the Hittite archives implies that the imperial court watched these contacts closely, and that foreign kings could use transparency as a weapon, exposing the intrigues of a client ruler by sharing letters with the empire he served. Other late fragments place Western names inside lists of towns and regions, mention raids, and refer to individuals whose stories began decades earlier. Some texts even preserve crude moral commentary, portraying certain Westerners as impure or disorderly, sometimes through anecdotes about ritual misconduct. It is hard to know how much of this is prejudice, political messaging, or genuine social observation. What can be said is that the West remained othered in imperial thinking, a place admired for its wealth and roots, feared for its instability, and repeatedly described as untrustworthy. Finally, the appearance of Arzawa in magical and medical traditions points to another dimension of contact. Alongside armies and treaties, there was movement of specialists, men and women identified as experts in ritual or magic. Their names and origins appear in lists and procedures, suggesting that Western knowledge, whether admired or distrusted, circulated into the imperial core. Even when political narratives fall silent, these side channels preserve the sense that the West was not distant. It was constantly present, in diplomacy, in fear, in gossip, in border war, and even in the private anxieties that drove people to seek protection through ritual. The Kaska were one of those unlucky peoples of the ancient Near East, who left no written record in their own voice. Because of that silence, almost everything known about them comes through the eyes of others. Above all, through the archives of the state that fought them most often, the Hittite kingdom. Their presence emerges from tablets produced in the great administrative centres of central Anatolia, and from correspondence written in frontier garrisons close to the northern borderlands. In those letters, the Kaska are frequently not even named. They appear as the enemy, a threatening shadow at the edge of settled territory, reported in urgent messages about raids, ambushes, stolen herds, burned fields and towns that suddenly go quiet. Outside the Hittite world, their name surfaces only rarely, in a handful of foreign documents. The imbalance is obvious. Most of the surviving material comes from the Hittite side, and that fact shapes the image from the beginning. Archaeology has not yet produced an unmistakable Kaska material culture. There are no clearly identified cities, cemeteries, or monuments that can be pointed to with confidence and called Kaska. One familiar explanation is that they built largely in timber, using architecture that decays fast and leaves little trace. That may be part of the story, but it does not solve the deeper problem. If an entire population lived in these landscapes, for generations, it should have left behind small things as well. Tools, pottery patterns, metal items, traces of habitations, hearths, storage pits, paths, seasonal camps. The real difficulty is that no one can say with certainty what to look for. The written sources describe movement, raiding, herding, and a way of life that does not fit easily into the categories that make archaeological cultures visible. If the Kaska carried off goods from Hittite temples and towns, then the most Kaska objects in their territory might actually be Hittite objects taken as loot and used in new contexts. That possibility complicates every search. The Kaska enter the record not because the Hittites were curious about their traditions or interested in their worldview, but because the Kaska were a practical problem. Mentions of them arise from conflict, logistics, security, and political survival. This is why the Kaska appear again and again as danger rather than as neighbours. The tone of the Hittite descriptions is often harsh, sometimes openly contemptuous. Like many states confronting unfamiliar peoples at their borders, the Hittites produced stereotypes quickly and repeated them until they hardened into a moral portrait. In the texts, the Kaska become the kind of enemy who can do every wrong at once. They attack, kill, plunder, burn, steal, and vanish back into rough country. The same acts, committed by the Hittites in their own campaigns, are framed very differently when the narrative is told from the palace. Over time, the language grows sharper, and the insults become part of the political vocabulary. The Kaska are pushed outside the circle of civilized behaviour by words that reduce them to caricature. A striking example of this attitude can be seen in regulations connected to a border settlement that likely stood in the Kelkit Valley, a region of narrow passages, river corridors, and harsh terrain that makes control difficult. The town had been ruined in earlier fighting and lay abandoned for a long time. Later, it was repopulated and fortified as part of a larger strategy to stabilize the frontier. Captives and relocated groups were used to rebuild, a common tool of imperial policy, and cult life was restored to anchor the community around ritual obligations as well as military duty. Yet even after these efforts, the settlement remained vulnerable. Raids and counter-raids continued. The frontier was not a line on a map, but a wide zone of pressure, fear, and sudden violence. In this setting, the authorities imposed rules that reveal more than military planning. They expose anxiety, mistrust, and a belief that danger could seep into the town through ordinary contact. Armed casca were not to enter. Charioteers were to drop passengers at the gate and turn back without crossing the threshold. Legal disputes involving casca were not to be heard inside the town, not even at the gate itself, but outside, away from the settled space. Casca were not to remain within the walls and certainly not overnight. If one was found inside after dark, imprisonment followed immediately. Even people acquired in casca territory, slaves or attendants, were barred from living within the town and were instead kept outside in separate facilities. Farmers and shepherds were warned against mingling with casca, as if conversation itself could become a risk. Those who joined the casca were treated as traitors, whose households could be seized, their families bound to the town's authority and their property absorbed into the community's assets. The language attached to these rules goes beyond security. It describes the casca as inherently contaminating, not merely as an armed threat, but as a source of ritual danger. This kind of accusation is severe because ritual impurity is not just dirt. It implies an invisible force that can disrupt the favor of the gods, spoil ceremonies, and bring disaster. In such a worldview, admitting a polluting person is not a minor lapse, but a crime against the stability of the entire community. The punishments described for allowing such a person to stay could extend to death, not only for the offender, but for the offender's family. The point was to make the boundary absolute. The town was to remain a sealed container of order in a landscape imagined as unstable. The hostility did not stop there. The texts sometimes compare the casca to animals in ways that suggest disgust and ridicule, even when the meaning of the saying is no longer clear. At the same time, trade with them could be forbidden. That prohibition is revealing. Trade is the simplest bridge between enemies, a way to turn violence into exchange. When trade is banned, it signals that the other side is being treated not as a rival community, but as a category of people with whom normal relations are considered unacceptable. This is exactly why any reconstruction of casca society must keep a critical distance from the Hittite image-making. The sources are invaluable, but they are not neutral. They were written to serve policy and to justify fear. Even so, the surviving documents do allow the outlines of a casca world to be sketched. The main streams of information come from several types of Hittite records. First are royal narratives of war, reports and commemorations that describe campaigns, raids, counterattacks, destroyed districts, captured leaders, and rebuilt towns. These texts present the frontier as an endless struggle, a cycle that repeats across generations. Next come treaties made with casca leaders, which offer some of the clearest clues about political structure. Unlike treaties between major states, these agreements were often not made with a single king. Instead, they were concluded with multiple chiefs, suggesting a landscape of separate groups that could form alliances but did not always obey a central authority. The Hittite state clearly wanted predictable partners, yet the documents show frustration with how quickly commitments could dissolve once the ceremony ended. Treaties also reveal what mattered most in day-to-day contact: fugitives, stolen property, and the movement of people across the border. They include clauses demanding the return of refugees who had fled from Hittite lands with tools, livestock, or knowledge. They warn against giving shelter to those who insulted the Hittite king or sought to escape punishment. They ask Casca leaders to block the routes of hostile agents trying to pass through Casca territory, to strike deeper into Hittite lands. At the same time, the Hittites expected Casca groups to assist Hittite forces moving through the borderlands on campaign against other enemies, as if the frontier could be turned on and off according to imperial need. These texts also hint at economic patterns. Herding appears again and again, suggesting that livestock mattered greatly. There are rules about keeping enemy herds out of Casca country, not simply to prevent grazing disputes, but because the movement of animals could become a political signal. Bringing in large herds might enable scattered groups to gather, cooperate, and build stronger coalitions. The Hittites feared exactly that, the emergence of unity among groups that were otherwise fragmented. The treaties even include detailed instructions on what to do when Casca and Hittite herds mixed, a practical issue that becomes a matter of security. The most intense parts of these agreements are the oath formulas. The language is dramatic, filled with threats of divine punishment that imagine bodies turning against themselves, weapons betraying their owners, households failing to multiply, and children dying before adulthood. The goal was to press obedience into the deepest level of belief, to make disloyalty feel not only dangerous, but cosmically doomed. The sheer intensity suggests how hard it was to enforce policy in these regions. When institutions are weak at the border, words become weapons. Another major source is prayer. Some of the earliest near-contemporary descriptions of Casca raids appear not in battle reports, but in religious complaints addressed to the gods. These prayers describe temples attacked, cult centers damaged, sacred objects and precious offerings carried off. They portray the Hittite kings and queens as caretakers, struggling to maintain order, pleading for divine support against an enemy who seems to strike every year. The emotional tone is important. It shows how raids were interpreted, not merely as military events, but as spiritual crises. When sacred statues and offerings are stolen, it is not just loss of wealth. It is a wound to the relationship between city, ruler, and deity. The prayers therefore serve as historical evidence, even when they use exaggeration and rhetorical colour, to awaken pity and urgency. Ritual texts add another layer. Some describe ceremonies performed before military expeditions, designed to secure victory and to neutralise the dangerous forces believed to surround the borderlands. Lists of deities invoked in these rites include major Hittite gods, as well as local powers connected to mountains and rivers, showing how geography itself was treated as alive with agency. In some cases, the rites even address the gods of the Casca, attempting to lure them away from their people and draw them toward the Hittite side. This is a striking strategy. The enemy is fought not only with soldiers, but with the hope of shifting divine loyalties. Administrative orders and instruction texts aimed at officers on the frontier provide yet another viewpoint. Routine. They show how defense was organized, how watch systems worked, and how fear shaped daily behavior. One method described involves preparing the ground to read footprints, making it easier to track infiltrators who cross by night. The technique is so practical that it feels modern, a reminder that border control has always been a contest between movement and detection, between those who know the terrain and those who try to police it. Letters from officials complete the picture, reporting enemy movements, asking for reinforcements, describing damage, and revealing the strain of holding an exposed position season after season. Divination texts also matter. In them, commanders do not only plan routes and tactics, they ask whether the gods approve. The questions map the landscape indirectly. Mountain spirits, towns, passes, and targets appear as the objects of inquiry. The volume of such questions suggests anxiety and a desire to reduce uncertainty in a world where a single misstep could mean disaster. Not every divination result could have been acted upon, yet the very act of asking shows the psychological environment of frontier warfare. Against this background, a rare glimpse of Casca political life appears in a Hittite narrative about a leader who tried to rule in a new way. The Hittite text treats him as an exception, someone who attempted to act like a single king over multiple groups, standing out in a region where leadership was usually dispersed among chiefs. His challenge is described not only as a political threat, but as an inversion of the expected order. The story ends as many such stories do in imperial archives. With the enemy defeated, territory burned, the leader captured and brought back to the capital, and a contested district rebuilt and claimed as part of the Hittite realm. The narrative is triumphant, yet it also acknowledges, indirectly, how dangerous unity among the Casca could be. Where, then, did the Casca live? Early scholarship once searched for them across wide parts of Anatolia, but over time the strongest arguments pulled their homeland toward the north. The Hittite sources describe them as close enough to menace even the central regions at moments of weakness, and the pattern of attacks suggests proximity to the Hittite heartland. Northern Anatolia, with its mountains, forests, and river valleys, fits the strategic logic. It offers cover, routes for rapid raids, and natural barriers against large armies. The exact edges of Casca territory remain uncertain. Borders likely shifted with the strength of each side, expanding and contracting across decades. To the north, the Black Sea forms a hard boundary, but even there it is unclear how far Casca groups approached the coast or what relationship they had with maritime life. The sources say little about ships or seafaring, which may reflect real absence or simply the silence of the archive. To the east, the picture meets other named regions known from Hittite texts, places associated with their own peoples and conflicts. To the west, some have imagined Casca influence stretching far, even toward regions later famous in classical geography. Yet, such an enormous area may be difficult to assign to a single loosely defined label. It may be more realistic to imagine a patchwork. Multiple groups, some of them Casca, some of them related, some of them simply placed under the same name by outsiders, who did not distinguish carefully between communities, separated by ridges and valleys. That last point may be the most important. Casca could be less an ethnic self-definition than an imperial category, a name stamped onto many northern groups who lived beyond direct control and appeared in the archive mainly when trouble followed them. The mountains of the Black Sea Zone, in later periods, hosted many distinct peoples living in close proximity, yet separated by geography and custom. Ancient observers could easily collapse that diversity into a single label, especially when writing under pressure, reporting danger, or justifying harsh policy. The Casca language and ethnic origins remain among the hardest questions, precisely because there is no continuous internal record. Hittite sources preserve names of persons and places associated with the Casca world, yet names alone rarely reveal grammar or deeper linguistic structure. Many names look similar to those known from other Anatolian contexts, which could mean shared cultural space, borrowing, intermarriage, or simply that outsiders recorded what they heard through their own phonetic habits. Without longer texts, it is nearly impossible to prove relationships with neighbouring languages. Hypotheses have been proposed in the past, some stretching toward distant connections. but most remain speculation because the evidence cannot carry the weight. Religious clues are slightly more promising. Some divine names associated with the Casca seem closer to older Anatolian traditions than to later imperial forms, which could hint at deep roots in the region. If that is true, then the Casca may not have been late intruders at all. They could have been local communities pushed into the northern highlands by political change, adapting to harsher terrain and developing forms of life that left fewer durable traces. Another possibility is that they were never a single people in the first place, but a coalition of groups whose identities shifted over time, whose alliances were temporary, and whose name in the archive reflects the Hittite need to categorize threats, more than it reflects the Casca sense of themselves. This uncertainty should shape the story told about them. It is easy to repeat the ancient insult that labels them as primitive destroyers, enemies of civilization. Yet that conclusion depends on accepting an imperial narrative at face value. The Hittites were powerful, literate, and institutionally complex, but they were also conquerors who used violence, forced resettlement, and propaganda. The Casca appear most vividly where the Hittite state felt exposed, in burned towns, empty temples, stolen offerings, and anxious letters sent from garrisons. In that mirror, the Casca become a symbol of disorder. That symbolism tells as much about Hittite fear as it does about Casca life. For anyone trying to understand the early history of Anatolia, one question returns again and again. When did the people later known as the Casca first appear in this land? The surviving Hittite documents offer no clear answer. In fact, even the beginnings of Hittite presence themselves fade into uncertainty. The texts of the old Hittite period remain silent about the Casca, and this absence has encouraged some scholars to assume that the Casca must have emerged only much later, perhaps in the 14th century BC. Others have gone even further, doubting the authenticity of later records that describe earlier Casca history. Yet these same voices often accept far more speculative claims when the subject involves Indo-European migrations or legendary ancestries. Against such caution, it is entirely possible that the Casca were already present in Anatolia during the Old Hittite Age, even if the few surviving chronicles did not consider them worth mentioning. The silence of those early texts may simply reflect the political realities of the time. The Casca might not yet have played the disruptive role they would later assume, and the Hittites may have left them largely undisturbed in their mountain homelands. Perhaps they were related to the Hatti, the older inhabitants of central Anatolia. While the more urbanized Hatti lived in the southern plains, the Casca may have led a pastoral life in the northern highlands, beyond the limits of Hittite control. In that early era, before the great conflicts, coexistence could well have been peaceful. Archaeology confirms that long before the Hittite kingdom expanded, cities such as Kusara, Kanesh, Purushanda, Alakahoyuk, and many others were flourishing centres of Hattian culture. These towns formed the backbone of Anatolian civilization until waves of conquest transformed the landscape. It is not difficult to imagine the Casca supplying livestock and dairy products to these urban communities, much as Turkoman tribes would later interact with Byzantine villagers in medieval times. When the Hittite campaigns burned and destroyed many of those ancient cities, a demographic vacuum emerged. The Casca, always mobile, could have drifted southward into the devastated territories. Throughout these centuries, the political focus of the Hittite state lay to the south, towards Syria and Mesopotamia. Northern Anatolia remained a secondary concern, and this neglect allowed the Casca to strengthen. Nothing in the evidence prevents us from accepting their existence in the Old Hittite period. Indeed, the very system the Hittites later used to colonize frontier lands, suggests a long confrontation. Land grants were issued to loyal officials, border garrisons were established, and occupied regions were gradually integrated. The method resembles, in spirit at least, the Roman Latinization of Italy, though in Anatolia the process never achieved such lasting success. Rich pastures, forests, and mineral deposits made the northern highlands attractive, but they were never truly Hittitized. Hittite historical writing itself begins with a legendary figure called Labana, yet no contemporary record of him survives. Generations later, scribes struggled to reconstruct the remote past and often confused Labana with Hattusili, projecting the deeds of one onto the other. Still later, texts claimed that Labana and King Hantili had already fought the Kaska and kept them beyond the river Kumasmaha. If taken literally, this would push Kaska presence back to the very dawn of Hittite history. But such passages were composed centuries after the events, and served political propaganda as much as memory. Other late traditions blamed Hantili for the loss of the sacred city of Nerik, allegedly seized by the Kaska and left in ruins for hundreds of years. Yet contemporary sources from Hantili's reign speak only of campaigns against the Hurrians and the Syrian frontier. The true enemies of that time were probably southern powers, not northern tribes. Only with King Amuna do we find reliable reports of expeditions into what would later be known as Kaska territory. By the Middle Hittite period, relations had clearly deteriorated. Documents list captured Kaska nobles, sometimes blinded to prevent escape. Their names reveal a mosaic of local communities scattered across the mountains. Egyptian letters even ask for Kaska people to be sent as part of diplomatic exchanges, proof that the tribe had become a recognized political force. On the eve of Suppiluliuma's rise, Kaska bands crossed the Halis River and reached as far as Nanasa near modern Aksaray. From then on, the northern front would consume enormous Hittite resources. To understand how such tensions arose, one must look back to the age before the Hittite Empire, to the era of the Assyrian trading colonies. This was Anatolia's first encounter with the literate world of Mesopotamia. Caravans brought luxury goods, metals, and new technologies. Most important of all, they introduced writing. Yet the local populations did not immediately adopt the script. Their societies were not yet organized around bureaucratic needs. Only with the formation of the Hittite state did cuneiform become an essential tool. During the colony period, Indo-European speaking groups such as the Hittites, Luwians, and Palaic peoples were already settling among the older Hattian inhabitants. They lived side by side with Assyrian merchants in cities like Kadesh, creating a complex symbiosis. Had the Hittites not later forged a disciplined military state, this coexistence might have left little mark on history. Instead, it laid the foundations for a new power. The memory of that earlier world lingered. Hittite language itself was called the tongue of Nesa after Kadesh. Myths spoke of the kings of Kusara and Zalpa, of rivalries that predated the empire. The famous inscription attributed to King Anita, though preserved only in Hittite translation, reflects those turbulent beginnings. Whether originally written in Akkadian or another Anatolian language, it entered the royal archives as part of the ideological heritage of the dynasty. Later, rulers manipulated such memories for their own legitimacy. Hattusili III, who had seized the throne by force, traced his ancestry back to the ancient kings of Kusara to justify his claim. The scribes even reshaped royal genealogies to include those shadowy figures. Legends about the king of Mama, Anumhirbi, were copied in similar fashion. One tale describes a child abandoned in the mountains, rescued by a fisherman and destined for greatness. a motif shared with stories from Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. These narratives served not as accurate history, but as symbolic links to a heroic past. Another tradition tells of a queen of Kadesh who cast her newborn sons into a river, only for them to survive and return as strangers. The myth may have been adapted to discredit the rulers of Zalpa, enemies of early Hittite kings, by hinting at illicit origins. Such stories reveal how propaganda and folklore intertwined in the shaping of identity. Even religious rituals preserved echoes of the colony age. Ceremonies performed along the Hulana River involved the sacred garment of the king of Kusara, perhaps representing Anita himself. Texts mention merchants from Kadesh and Salatiwara taking part in festivals as if the memory of those trading communities had never faded. These fragments suggest that beneath the official chronicles lay a deeper layer of cultural continuity. The gulf between the prosperous colony era and the later imperial age, therefore, was not absolute. Material culture, administrative practices, and even elements of royal ideology passed from one world to the next. Yet, much was lost. Cities were destroyed, populations displaced, and new powers rose from the ruins. The Kaska, emerging from the northern highlands, became both a symptom and a cause of that transformation. Religion can be understood as the whole set of ties people build with the divine powers they believe exist. Few social forces have reached as deeply into daily life or gathered large communities around shared ideas in the same way. In many traditions, whether they speak of many gods or one, the relationship is imagined as unequal. Divine beings command, humans obey. Messages believed to come from the gods appear through different channels: prophets, seers, dreams, trance states, then become fixed into recognizable patterns. Rituals repeated in set sequences. Festival ceremonies performed on specific dates. Formal prayers spoken with careful words. These practices form the working structure of religion, the part that can be observed, taught, and passed on. Yet the further one moves into periods without writing, the harder it becomes to speak with certainty. Without texts, religion cannot be reconstructed in detail. At best, it can be outlined by comparing later traditions, ethnographic parallels, and the broad patterns of religious history. Even when written records exist, they do not always provide what modern readers expect. In the case of the Hittite state archives, the surviving material is extensive, but direct explanations of theology are rare. There are no systematic sacred books laying out doctrine, no long teachings attributed to prophets, in the way later religions might preserve them. What survives is practical: lists, ritual instructions, official festival protocols, prayers tied to urgent needs, documents that show how worship was done rather than why the cosmos was believed to work in a certain way. Across many early societies, the first religious imagination often begins with the forces that dominate life. Storm, rain, wind, the movement of the sky, the rhythms of seasons. People treated these powers as living presences. Over time, those presences could be represented in different forms. Sometimes a river, a mountain, the sea, or a spring was not only a place but a divine figure in its own right, or the visible body through which a god was present in the world. The Hittite texts still preserve traces of this way of thinking, where natural features appear as divine actors. Elsewhere in the same tradition, gods could be indicated by objects rather than human shapes. A storm god might once have been shown as a weapon, another deity as a mace, another as a cluster of daggers. In these older layers, the symbol carries the presence, and the presence matters more than an elaborate image. As communities shifted from hunting and gathering into farming and herding, the centre of religious concern also shifted. life depended on fertility, growth, and the forces that made fields yield and animals multiply. The earth that receives seed, the rain that falls from the sky, the sun that warms, the storm that both threatens and refreshes, these became the great partners in a cosmic balance. Many ancient stories describe this as a pairing, sky and earth as a couple whose union produces the living world. In that way of thinking, plants, trees, and reeds are not simply things that grow. They are the visible result of a divine relationship that must be renewed through correct ritual attention. Another change is visible in how the divine is pictured. In the earliest imagination, gods could be animals because animals embody strength, danger, speed, and fertility in ways humans respect and fear. Bulls, wild boars, leopards, deer, such creatures appear again and again as sacred signs. Later, the gods become more human in form. They eat and drink, they sit on thrones, they travel, they accept gifts, they grow angry, they become calm. Much later still, some religions begin to speak of the divine more abstractly, as something beyond any image. In Anatolia and the wider Mediterranean world, there was also a long-lasting reverence for a powerful mother figure connected to fertility and birth. Small figurines, often made from clay or stone, show women with exaggerated features associated with childbirth and nourishment. These objects were not only art, they were part of a lived religious world, handled, placed in special spaces, perhaps even used in ceremonies. When the Hittites appear in history, their official religion is striking for its size. It is a polytheistic system with an enormous pantheon, filled not only with local gods, but also with deities adopted from neighbouring peoples. In many cases, these borrowed divine figures arrived through diplomacy, marriage alliances, conquest, and cultural exchange. That is why the Hittite religious landscape looks like a mixture rather than a single, pure tradition carried intact from some distant homeland. Even the famous phrase, "the thousand gods," should not be taken literally as a count of deities worshipped individually by every person. It is better understood as a way of saying all the gods, countless gods. Especially in treaties, rituals, oaths, and formal texts that aim to include every divine witness, without naming each one. In practice, no king or ordinary worshipper could maintain daily offerings for 1,000 separate beings. The huge number reflects something else. The tendency to treat many objects, places, and powers as sacred in their own right, plus the reality that many divine names did not have full institutional worship, no dedicated temple, no fixed clergy, no regular calendar, only occasional attention in local contexts. In the landscape of Hittite worship, sacred presence could be marked by stone. Stelae were set in natural settings, near springs, rivers, and wooded places, serving as focal points where offerings could be made and ritual words spoken. Some sites grew into monumental sacred places that gathered multiple traditions together. In the capital, physical space was limited, so many of these sacred stones were gathered into temple courtyards. The city itself became a kind of religious archive in stone and architecture, reflecting a state system that collected divine powers the way it collected alliances, bringing them into one political centre. Even with such complexity, the inner logic of this religion is not built on abstract dogma. It is often practical, almost contractual. The core expectation is reciprocity. People give, the gods return favour. Offerings are not simply gifts of love. They are part of an exchange meant to maintain order and prevent disaster. The gods are treated as powerful, yet also dependent. They do not farm, they do not grind grain, they do not produce bread or beer. Humans do. That means the gods require human service to keep their cult alive. Food, drink, incense, festivals, ritual cleanliness, music, and respectful attention. In this worldview, worship is not only submission, it is maintenance. If maintenance stops, the relationship collapses, and the result is believed to be famine, disease, political failure, or military defeat. This way of thinking appears clearly in stories and ritual speech. A divine figure might argue that destroying humanity would also destroy the god's own comfort, because no one would remain to bake bread, for offerings, or pour drink before the divine images. In the same spirit, a ritual specialist negotiating for a sick person does not merely beg. He presents valuable items, grain, metals, stones, crafted goods, as a structured offer, asking for life in return. The speech is built like a bargain. It does not present the gods as distant ideals. It treats them as powerful partners who can be persuaded by gifts, honour, and careful words. The same principle governs vows. A promise to a deity can be conditional. If a city is saved from fire, a silver model of that city will be made and offered. If an illness ends, a specific number of animals will be given. If a campaign succeeds, a festival will be performed. This is not hidden. It is openly stated. Even frustration appears in the sources, where a worshipper who believes a god has failed to help may demand the return of gifts previously given, as if the contract has been broken. The relationship is not romanticized, it is managed. In this religious world, divine beings resemble humans in temperament. They have families, rivalries, alliances, and conflicts. They can be pleased, offended, jealous, or indifferent. They can protect a king or abandon him. They can leave the land, and their departure is imagined as a catastrophe that empties the world of prosperity. Temples are built as places where the gods can be hosted on earth, especially through their images and sacred objects. These buildings are decorated, cleaned, perfumed with incense, filled with offerings, not simply to honour the gods, but to keep them present and willing to stay. Because divine images mattered, their care became a serious duty. They were washed, oiled, dressed, repaired when worn, treated as if they were living. During ceremonies, they could be carried on platforms, from one place to another, with the same attention given to important persons. Ritual purity was a major concern. The problem was not hygiene in a modern sense. It was symbolic cleanliness. Certain animals, certain kinds of contact, and especially contact with death, could make people and objects ritually dangerous. That danger had to be removed through prescribed actions. If the correct order was broken, it was believed the gods would react. Festivals made this system visible on a grand scale. At a distance, a festival might look like celebration. Rich meals, music, dancing, athletic contests, staged performances, loud instruments, processions, formal greetings, repeated gestures. Up close, it is tightly regulated. Each action has a place and a time. The king, acting as high priest, is central. The court, officials, ritual specialists, musicians, performers, cooks, guards, and attendants all have assigned roles. The gods are present through images and sacred objects, treated like honoured guests. The feast is not offered because the gods need food in a literal sense. It is performed because feeding and entertaining the divine is believed to secure life, health, and abundance for the people. The scale of these festivals creates a practical problem. There are many, some lasting weeks. A king who must lead armies, administer a state, and travel between regions cannot personally attend every ceremony in every place. The system solves this through delegation and representation, but the pressure remains. In the Hittite imagination, neglecting festivals risks divine anger, and divine anger is as dangerous as an enemy army. A ruler might choose to send generals to war so he can fulfill ritual duties. because a victory achieved while offending the gods could be judged worthless if it leads to plague, famine, or political collapse. Prayers follow the same practical pattern. The surviving prayers are mostly royal prayers, created for moments of crisis. They are not gentle meditations. They are arguments. The speaker explains what has happened, admits faults, recounts failures in duty, then tries to persuade the gods to show mercy. The tone can resemble a courtroom. The divine is treated as judge, the king as the defendant who must prove sincerity and restore order. In such prayers, truth is emphasized. A god associated with light and justice is imagined as seeing everything, so deception is pointless. Confession, explanation, and compensation are the tools meant to change divine anger into calm. One of the most dramatic examples comes from a period of long-lasting epidemic. The land is pictured as shrinking under the weight of death. The ruler does not speak as a distant theologian. He speaks as someone watching his country collapse. He describes the disaster in concrete terms, then searches for causes. In this worldview, a plague is not simply a natural event. It is a sign that some obligation has been broken, some oath violated, some wrong left unaddressed. The prayer looks backward into political violence, into a scandal involving a murdered royal figure and broken loyalty oaths. The king acknowledges that earlier generations committed acts that stained the kingdom. He presents the gods as witnesses who saw it all. Then, he insists on a grim logic. The guilty are already dead. The price has already been paid, yet the suffering continues and now threatens to erase the people who maintain the god's cult. At that point, the argument becomes sharp. If the epidemic continues, the bakers who prepare offering bread will die. The people who pour drink offerings will die. The workers who keep temples running will vanish. The gods will still exist, but their life on earth, honor, comfort, ritual care, will collapse. The prayer pushes the gods towards a decision. Accept repentance, accept compensation, end the plague, allow the cult to continue. The king asks for mercy not only for himself, but for the system that binds gods and humans together. In effect, he describes a mutual dependence. The gods rule the world, yet the world they rule cannot function without people who serve them. The request is not sentimental. It is a calculated appeal built on the basic structure of the religion: exchange, duty, repair, and restoration. Across the ancient world, few questions troubled people more deeply than what awaited them after death. Every community sought an answer. Would life continue in another form, or did everything end with the final breath? The Hittites were no exception. Although their written records about the afterlife are fragmentary, a general picture can still be drawn. They believed that death was not an absolute end. Even if the body decayed and returned to dust, something essential, what they called the spirit or breath, would survive and travel beyond the visible world. Many imagined that the spirits of the dead rose to the sky and lived there in a manner somewhat similar to earthly existence. Other traditions hinted that ordinary people descended into a cold and shadowy underworld, while only kings enjoyed a more elevated fate. In a land as diverse as Anatolia, with many languages and peoples, these ideas were never uniform. Different regions preserved different visions of the hereafter, and no single doctrine ever dominated. Funeral customs reveal this mixture of beliefs. Royal family members were often cremated, their burned bones carefully collected and buried with solemn ceremonies that lasted for many days. For common people, burial in the earth was more usual, yet archaeologists have struggled to locate large cemeteries of the major Hittite cities. Texts show how important it was to care for the dead. Offerings had to be made, tombs maintained, and the spirits appeased. Neglected souls were feared to become restless demons, bringing illness and misfortune to the living. Numerous rituals were designed to calm such angry shades and restore harmony between the worlds. At the same time, the Hittites knew that death was irreversible. Foreign myths circulating in their libraries described the realm below as a grim place where the dead ate dust and could not recognize one another. These gloomy images resembled what later generations would call hell. Yet the desire to overcome mortality remained powerful, especially among kings who hoped to become divine after death and join the gods in the heavens. Belief in magic permeated everyday life. When the Hittites entered Anatolia, they were warriors rather than scholars, but they quickly absorbed the ancient traditions of the local peoples. Magic became a bridge between human weakness and divine power. Specialists from many regions arrived at the capital, offering their knowledge for generous payment. Some towns were famous entirely for sorcery and music, and their practitioners resembled the fortune tellers still seen in modern villages. Magic was not viewed as a single craft. There were healers, seers, midwives, priests, and professional magicians, both women and men. Their services were needed for every crisis: illness, quarrels within families, infertility, military defeat, bad dreams, or ominous celestial events. Two forms were recognized. Harmful magic intended to injure another person was feared and punished by law. Protective or healing magic, on the other hand, was welcomed and practiced even at the royal court. In truth, the techniques were similar, only the intention made them black or white. Rituals followed strict principles. The time and place had to be chosen carefully. Dawn, moonlit nights, untouched fields, mountain springs, or rooftops close to the sky were favoured settings. The magician relied on suggestion and symbolism, convincing the sufferer that hostile forces were being driven away. Much of this rested on analogy. As one action occurred in the ritual, so would the same effect happen in real life. If fat melted in the fire, the illness would melt as well. If a knot was untied, the obstacle in a person's fate would loosen. Nature provided countless models: how a seed swells in water, how a vine bears fruit, how a stone remains firm, how water cleanses dirt, and each observation became a tool of transformation. Medicine and magic were inseparable. Plants, oils, and ointments were applied, while spells were spoken. A king who lost his speech after witnessing volcanic eruptions was treated with both herbs and elaborate purification rites. For sexual weakness, a man passed through a symbolic hut, carrying objects of femininity and masculinity, while prayers promised that he would regain his vigour. Even psychological therapy existed. Hopeful myths were recited to the sick, assuring them that just as gods had overcome darkness, they too would rise from their beds. One ritual describes the creation of a small figure from reed, dressed like a bride. The patient lay beside this doll, as if married to it, transferring his suffering to the substitute. After 3 days, the effigy was buried or burned, carrying the disease away. Another ceremony, performed by a woman named Mastiga, sought to reconcile relatives who hated each other. Bread, wine, animals, and clay models were used while she declared that the poisonous tongues of anger would be cut off like threads and thrown into the fire. Sheep, dogs, even lizards acted as stand-ins for human guilt. Water washed the participants, and new garments symbolized a fresh beginning. Through such dramatic gestures, families hoped to restore peace. Historical records show that magic could also be dangerous. Queens were accused of killing rivals through sorcery, and ambitious officials tried to weaken their enemies with secret rites. Because of these scandals, early laws forbade harmful spells, yet belief in supernatural power never faded. The Roman statesman Cicero once observed that no people and no ruler in the world had ever lived without consulting divination. His remark captures a universal truth. Ancient societies believed that the gods constantly shaped human destiny, and that their decisions could be read in signs scattered across nature. If those signs were understood in time, disaster might be avoided and success secured. For the Hittites, as for many others, divination was not a curiosity but a practical instrument of government. Two main approaches existed. The first relied on spontaneous omens. The gods were thought to reveal their will through extraordinary events. Eclipses of the sun or moon, unusual stars, malformed births, dreams, or the strange behavior of animals. This method, inherited largely from Mesopotamia, used a complex technical vocabulary and demanded trained specialists. The second approach was more proactive. Instead of waiting for heaven to speak, priests deliberately created situations in which the divine answer could be forced out. This form, deeply rooted in Anatolian tradition, became the everyday tool of the Hittite court. In principle, divination was a royal privilege. Ordinary people may have believed in signs, but official inquiries were conducted for kings and queens. Treaties even warned vassal rulers not to consult omens when military aid was demanded, since hesitation could endanger the empire. The range of questions asked was astonishing. Rulers wanted to know which city was safe for winter residence, which road an army should take, whether a festival should be held, or even in which month the king might die. Doctors, medicines, building projects, dreams, rumours, and crimes, all were submitted to the judgment of the gods through ritual inquiry. The value of these records is immense. Because the priests searched for the cause of divine anger, they listed every possible mistake committed in the palace or the provinces. Nothing was too shameful to be examined: theft from temples, neglect of offerings, illicit affairs, insults spoken in anger, even the cutting of sacred trees. Witnesses were questioned under oath, archives were consulted, and the results carefully written down. Without these protocols, the hidden life of the Hittite state would be almost invisible today. Four principal techniques were favoured. The first was a form of lot casting, a native Anatolian practice whose exact mechanics remain uncertain. Objects representing ideas such as life, illness, prosperity, or disaster were thrown like gaming pieces, and the combination determined the answer. A typical question asked whether the king and queen could safely spend the winter in the capital and celebrate certain festivals there. If the favourable tokens outweighed the harmful ones, the reply was considered positive. The second and most characteristic method was bird divination. Long before similar practices appeared in Italy, Anatolian priests watched the movements of eagles, hawks, cranes, and dozens of other species. They studied how the birds took off, landed, called, fought, or crossed the path from right to left. Specialists sometimes travelled for weeks to river deltas and marshes where migratory flocks gathered, sending reports back to the king by courier. An official letter describes how, during a campaign against northern tribes, observers established a station near a fortress and waited for the decisive signs that would tell whether the army should attack. Even a single unexpected bird seen by the king could trigger a full investigation. A third technique involved the inspection of sacrificial animals. After a sheep or other creature was killed, its liver, lungs, stomach, and gall were examined for unusual marks. This practice, introduced from the south through Hurrian intermediaries, resembled methods used in Babylonia. Models of livers were even produced as teaching tools, showing the zones that carried meaning. The results were recorded with the same seriousness as military orders. The fourth and least known method employed water snakes. The animals were released into a basin divided into symbolic sectors, each representing a possible outcome. The path the snake chose, where it entered, where it turned, was read as the voice of the gods. When exploring something as widely shared as music and dance, it is impossible to separate sound and movement from the land itself. Anatolia is not a flat stage where culture travels in straight lines. Mountains break regions apart. River valleys connect them again, and long coastlines open some communities to distant influences, while isolating others behind rugged passes. Over thousands of years, this geography helped produce an unusually layered cultural memory. Traditions could survive in one valley, even as a new language or a new political order rose somewhere else. For that reason, Anatolia developed a deep reservoir of folklore from very early times, and many strands of that reservoir still appear in everyday life. It is not only a matter of songs and dances. The same long memory shows itself in healing practices, ritual habits, popular beliefs, clothing styles, storytelling, the use of plants and household remedies, and the many small rules people follow without always remembering where they began. Some of that world is visible today. Much of it has vanished. Even so, the surviving traces suggest that music and dance were never separate entertainment categories. They were woven into how people marked time, celebrated, mourned, protected themselves from misfortune, and negotiated the invisible boundaries between the human and the sacred. For the second millennium before the Common Era, the strongest written window into Anatolia comes from the Hittite capital and its archives. These tablets were not designed to be cultural surveys. They were administrative instruments, ritual instructions, festival schedules, official inventories, and formal descriptions of ceremonies. The documents rarely explain things in a way a modern reader would want. They do not give a complete picture, and they often assume that everyone already understands the rules. Yet, when the texts are read as cultural evidence rather than as tidy history, they begin to look like field notebooks. Festivals and ritual procedures preserve local songs, recurring performance scenes, regional styles, and lists of specialized performers. In an unplanned way, the scribes and officials who recorded these events also preserved fragments of older traditions that might otherwise have disappeared. The result is a paradox. A state that wrote for control ended up keeping an accidental record of local colour. That record is not perfect, but it is rich enough to show that Anatolia's ceremonial life depended heavily on music, rhythmic sound, and choreographed movement. Cultural exchange in this world did not move in only one direction. It behaved more like connected vessels, rising and falling as groups interacted, competed, intermarried, migrated, or absorbed each other's customs. Borrowing happened when something was needed, a ritual technique, a performance style, a kind of instrument, a way to speak to the divine. A society that collects and adapts foreign material is often filling gaps in its own repertoire, searching for workable solutions in a crowded cultural landscape. Anatolia was exactly such a landscape. Unlike regions where one long-lasting cultural system dominated for centuries with fewer interruptions, Anatolia repeatedly experienced overlap. Different languages, different traditions, and different local identities living close together. That diversity kept cultural life from becoming uniform, and it created an environment where music and dance could carry layered meanings, sometimes local and intimate, sometimes official and theatrical. The texts allow a cautious comparison of three major cultural strands that shaped central Anatolia. The earliest local tradition that can be detected appears strongly attached to joyful music and lively communal play. It tends to avoid martial display and seems to lean toward festive, social performance. Another tradition, originating farther to the southeast and spreading into central regions during the second millennium, is repeatedly linked to laments and hymns. A musical taste that gravitates toward solemnity, praise, and grief. The Hittite state itself presents yet another profile. It shows enthusiasm for spectacle. Acrobatics, competitive performances, foreign melodies, and even staged combat displays. The important point is not to turn these tendencies into stereotypes, but to recognize that the archive preserves different emotional worlds and different performance preferences that coexisted in the same broader space. Even with this wealth of material, the limits are obvious. The tablets do not provide the kind of musical documentation modern people look for. There is no preserved songbook in the usual sense, no clear manual describing how instruments were built, no systematic explanation of scales, tuning, or performance technique. The archive is also separated from modern readers by distance in time, difficulties of language, and differences in how ancient societies understood the purpose of sound. What does come through again and again is the function of music. It appears as a ritual tool and as a social instrument. It signals entrances and exits, marks the beginning of ceremonies, accompanies offerings, and shapes the emotional atmosphere of gatherings. Because ritual life mirrored daily life, the music heard in sacred settings likely drew on the living folk repertory of the communities that performed it. It was not music invented only for gods. It was the sound of the people carried into formal ceremony. The written record also hints at how cultural influences entered Anatolia through writing itself. The Hittites adopted a script and adapted it to their own language. Along with that system came ideas and forms from the wider Near Eastern world, including liturgical traditions and performance elements. At the same time, an older local population remained culturally powerful in central Anatolia, even when political control changed hands. The state collected, organized, and absorbed what already existed in the land. Healing knowledge, ritual formulas, protective practices, and also songs and dances. The archive shows repeated attention to classification and careful reuse. Traditions were gathered not as museum objects, but as tools for ceremonies, festivals, and court life. The depth of Anatolia's musical history stretches far earlier than the Hittite age. Long before palaces stored tablets, communities in the region already knew rhythmic movement and structured performance. Later eras confirm that Anatolia continued to shape wider musical worlds. Certain regional styles became essential reference points for neighbouring civilizations, and the influence did not stop at borders. The suggestion is not that one single line runs unbroken from the earliest prehistory to later empires, but that Anatolia repeatedly generated powerful musical and performative traditions. And these traditions often travelled outward, while also absorbing outside elements. Myth and ritual show how people imagined music as more than sound. In stories, music can lure, calm, soften resistance, or draw hidden forces into the open. It can be used like a charm, not only to entertain, but to transform a situation. Myths describe divine figures using music as part of seduction, persuasion, and strategy. They also show a belief that some beings respond to melody and rhythm while others remain unmoved, as if the world itself contains different kinds of hearing. The implication is that music was considered a force that could act on bodies and minds. The same idea appears in healing contexts, where structured sound and storytelling are used to comfort and restore. In later Anatolian societies, music therapy became an explicit practice. The older evidence suggests that the concept has deep roots. Sound as a way to regulate emotion, calm fear, and rebalance a disturbed inner world. Because most recorded performances are ritual, ordinary village music remains largely invisible in the texts. Still, the ceremonial record is detailed enough to reconstruct scenes. Loud instruments announce royal movement, the arrival of important figures, or transitions during public events. Horn-like instruments built for volume are used in high places so the sound carries across rooftops and courtyards. At certain festivals, choruses perform in local languages, preserving older linguistic layers inside formal state events. At the same time, ritual rules sometimes demand silence. Not every moment allows music. Some parts of ceremonies require stillness, and some deities are treated as if they dislike musical noise altogether. That belief is practical as well as religious. Silence creates tension, emphasizes sacred words, and marks boundaries inside the ceremony. The archive, by recording when music must stop, indirectly shows how common music usually was. Regional performance groups also appear. Certain towns are described as sending choruses to major ceremonial centers, and their singers keep their local style even when performing for the court. These groups can look almost like professional ensembles. In some places, the record suggests that musical performance was not simply a pastime, but an economic role, a specialized craft that could support a community. During feasts and ceremonies, performers sometimes press the gathered crowd into participation, especially during refrains. The boundary between audience and performer becomes thin. Ritual is not passive entertainment. It is a shared action. Dance appears in equally varied forms. Some dances are described as circles or rings, bodies arranged in patterns that are still familiar in many communal traditions. Other scenes include lines of masked figures, staged disorder, and playful provocation. There are moments where performers imitate animals, wear skins, and reproduce cries or gestures associated with hunting and wildness. These are not random theatrics. They preserve very old symbolic memories. The hunt as a ritual act, the animal as both prey and power, the mask as transformation. In some rites, young participants perform in groups, moving around a table, turning repeatedly, and eating from specific cuts of meat during a carefully scripted sequence. The effect is part dance, part ceremony, part social bonding. Music also appears in mourning. When a ruler dies, the archive describes collective grief as a public duty. People of all ages are expected to take up instruments and play sorrowful melodies. Professional mourners are used alongside wider participation, and the deceased person's name is repeated loudly, as if sound itself can guide the soul, hold the community together, and push back the dangers imagined to surround death. The ritual does not only express sadness, it manages fear, it controls transition, it protects the living from the uncertainty created by the dead. One detail that stands out is the role of noise. Loud rhythm, especially drumming, is treated as a weapon against harmful forces. The belief that noise drives away invisible threats is widespread across cultures, and Anatolia preserves its own versions of it into much later times. The old ritual logic is consistent. Sound can cleanse space, break bad influence, and restore order when the world feels unstable. In a society where gods are imagined with human appetites and moods, performance becomes a form of hospitality. The divine is entertained with food, drink, song, movement, and spectacle, because these are the human methods for creating goodwill. Spectacle reaches beyond singing and dancing into acrobatics and staged games. Reliefs and painted vessels show performers climbing ladders to rooftops, swallowing blades, or staging carefully timed sequences that mix danger with control. Other scenes involve races, mock contests, playful teasing, splashing liquids, and other forms of communal humour that later societies would recognise as festival behaviour. The archive does not always explain why these actions mattered, but repeated patterns suggest that such entertainment was not accidental. It was part of the ritual economy. Joy offered as a gift, excitement used to raise energy, laughter employed to release tension. Instrument categories can be approached indirectly through the language used to describe playing. Different verbs imply striking, plucking, shaking, blowing, clapping, or vocalizing. That method is imperfect because people can strike a stringed instrument just as they strike a drum. Yet, it still provides a rough guide. The instrument world includes frame drums and tambourine-like objects, vessels that can be used as percussion, jingling devices that may combine metal and wood, and various harps and lyres that appear central to ceremonial sound. Wind instruments include flutes and reed pipes, sometimes played in pairs, and signal horns used for announcements rather than melody. Some sound devices are nearly invisible archaeologically. Rattles, small bells, wooden clappers, and household items repurposed as rhythm tools. The archive also hints that spears could be struck together to create sound during ritual performances that resemble battle games. A reminder that anything producing rhythm can become an instrument in the right setting. Performers form a diverse professional world. Female singers are especially prominent, and there are indications that when women were not available, male performers sometimes adopted a deliberately feminine vocal style. Musical personnel are listed, assigned, moved between households and institutions, and treated as assets that can be distributed, much like other specialized workers. Some wealthy figures keep musicians in their residences, suggesting a social environment where status includes the ability to host performance. At the top level, the palace and major temples organize and deploy ensembles. The archive even allows a glimpse of choir size, implying that choral performance was not rare. Alongside singers are many other roles: clappers, lamenters, horn players, drummers, harpists, healers who use sound, entertainers who sing and jump, and individuals skilled enough to combine voice and instrument in a single act. There is occasional discussion in scholarship about ancient notation systems in other Near Eastern contexts, including sets of named intervals and numerical instructions. Those systems are difficult to interpret with confidence, and attempts to reconstruct the music have produced results that many listeners find harsh. More importantly for Anatolia, the local evidence does not show that the Hittite ritual world used such notation in a clear, practical way. For this reason, the strongest approach is to focus on what the record truly preserves: contexts, functions, performer roles, instrument families, and repeated performance scenes. Melody and tuning remain mostly unreachable, while the social life of music is surprisingly visible. Vocal music in this world carries special weight. Many ceremonial songs are in languages other than the main administrative tongue. Refrains repeat, suggesting audience participation and a structure that relies on memory and communal response. The word used for song can also be used for epic narratives, implying that myths and heroic stories were recited in a musical manner rather than spoken plainly. In this sense, storytelling itself becomes performance. A myth is not only told, it is sung or chanted, carried by rhythm, voice, and repeated lines. Ceremonial descriptions sometimes offer vivid sequences. A royal couple drinks in honor of a deity using a special vessel. An attendant brings a particular kind of bread. The ruler bites, and at once the sound world turns on. A large harp is played. An entertainer sings, another performer claps. Drums and jingling instruments maintain continuous rhythm. Dancers move forward with a cup, kneel, approach, and the scene flows into the next dedication. Languages shift. Instruments continue. Performers cross in front of the rulers. The ceremony blends offering, banquet, music, dance, and court protocol into one integrated event. In such scenes, music is not decoration. It is one of the engines that keeps the ritual moving. Dance vocabulary and movement patterns show similar complexity. Some verbs imply stamping and intensity. Others imply turning, advancing, or chasing. Gestures include raising arms, bending, head movements, mimed pursuit, and actions designed to keep attention fixed on the ruler during public performance. Certain groups adjust formation so they do not present their backs to the king, opening a circle into a line, turning right, turning left, and shifting again in a choreography shaped by etiquette as much as by rhythm. Shouts in different languages appear as cues or expressions of excitement, like short calls that punctuate movement and lift the energy of the group. Costumes also matter. Colourful shirts, scarves, belts with jingling pieces, and even moments of deliberate nudity appear, not as modern spectacle, but as a practical and symbolic choice linked to movement and ritual meaning. Some of the most striking traditions involve animals. There are dances where performers wear masks or skins, imitate cries, and stage scenes that mix hunting symbolism with communal comedy. Beyond this, Anatolia preserves a remarkable performance tradition centered on the bull. Painted vessels depict acrobats vaulting over a bull's back in sequences that show motion step by step. Comparable scenes are known from the Aegean world, yet the deeper roots of the motif reach into Anatolia itself, where much earlier images already show bull-related ritual action. The continuity is not a simple straight line, but the recurrence across millennia suggests that bull symbolism and athletic display carried a long-lived ritual charge. Strength, fertility, rain, abundance, and a controlled encounter with dangerous power. Other festival scenes push toward the theatrical. Performers provoke laughter by acting oddly, chasing people, spraying liquids, or manipulating objects that create smell and surprise. In one sequence, two naked entertainers crouch inside an empty beer barrel, while priests and a leader of a female group circle the container repeatedly. Then they prod the performers with props, pour beer over them, and the naked figures leap up and run as signal instruments sound. The point is not cruelty, but inversion. It is a controlled moment where normal dignity is suspended, creating a ritual release that delights the audience and, within the logic of the ceremony, pleases the gods as well. In early pre-classical Anatolia, the Hittites were the first society to push architecture toward truly monumental scale. Their buildings were not just larger versions of earlier houses. They carried a new ambition: permanence. The most decisive step in that direction was the deliberate turn to stone, not as a minor support or a decorative detail, but as a fundamental element in major construction. Hittite builders trained stonecutters and sculptors who worked the material obsessively, almost as if they had become devoted to stone itself. Yet this passion was not simply an artistic mood. It reflected a practical conclusion drawn from experience. The strongest structures demanded the most durable material. A builder could raise walls of mud brick and wood, but anything intended to survive generations needed a base that resisted rot, fire, and collapse. Stone offered that promise of endurance. This intense attachment to stone is sometimes explained as an inherited habit brought from a distant homeland. That argument raises an obvious question. Where are the monumental stone buildings in that earlier land? The more convincing explanation lies closer to the ground, in the landscape of Anatolia itself. Much of central Anatolia is rocky, broken, and rich in workable stone. Hittite cities rose in regions where quarries were not distant resources, but part of the immediate environment. Their capital stood amid hard slopes and exposed bedrock, a place that almost forced builders to think in stone. The geology did not merely provide raw material. it shaped the mindset of construction, pushing architects toward a style that treated rock as the natural foundation of power. Even so, Hittite monumental architecture did not appear from nothing. The foundations of their building traditions were deeply influenced by the older cultures already living in Anatolia. Evidence from ritual traditions tied to construction suggests that Hittite methods grew out of earlier local practices. Long before the Hittites became a dominant political force, Anatolia had already produced impressive palatial complexes, built for local rulers in the trading age, when Assyrian merchants moved through central cities. Those pre-Hittite palaces demonstrate that the idea of grand architecture existed before Hittite expansion. What the Hittites did was to intensify it, spread it, and turn it into a state language of authority. As their power grew, buildings became instruments of representation. Architecture served religion, administration, and prestige at the same time. In developed societies, a building is never only a shelter, it becomes a message, a statement of legitimacy, a public symbol. This also explains a deeper paradox. The Hittites conquered, yet in many cultural fields they became students of the land they entered. Their art and architecture absorbed local traditions so thoroughly that the victor ended up shaped by the vanquished. Monumental stone architecture, in this view, is not simply a foreign import. It is a continuation of Anatolia's older building culture, amplified and reorganized under a new political system. Their engineering habits reveal the same mixture of ambition and careful practice. Hittite builders understood that monumental scale demands monumental preparation. They did not place heavy structures on unstable ground. They avoided sand, marsh, soft clay, and slippery soil. Whenever possible, they anchored major buildings on rocky terrain. If the location required it, they reshaped the ground before building began, creating artificial platforms that would not settle. One famous temple-palace complex stands as a dramatic example. Before the walls were raised, the builders filled and stabilized the area with an enormous depth of packed material. The result was a foundation so solid that even today, the surfaces show no clear signs of sinking. This was not luck. It was deliberate planning based on an understanding of how weight, or moisture, and soil behave over time. A proverb preserved in Hittite tradition captures the same principle in vivid form. It contrasts the wise choice of building on stone with the foolishness of placing a house in the path of floodwaters, where a sudden surge can erase everything. Behind the image lies a straightforward lesson. Durability begins before the first wall is built. It begins with the ground. There is, however, a frustrating limitation for modern researchers. In Mesopotamia, builders often left foundation inscriptions that explained what a building was and who commissioned it. The Hittites did not adopt this habit in any systematic way. That absence has consequences. Many large Hittite structures cannot be identified with certainty. Labels such as palace, barracks, archive, residence, or temple often rest on interpretation rather than explicit proof. Even distinguishing a palace from a temple can be difficult, because elite and sacred architecture shared features and sometimes merged functions. This is why archaeologists sometimes resort to hybrid terms, such as temple-palace, acknowledging that the true identity of the structure remains unclear. Yet the Hittites did preserve another practice that partly compensates for the lack of inscriptions. They performed construction rituals, ceremonies that combined religion, folklore, and a kind of protective magic. These rites were carried out before construction, during critical phases of building, and perhaps even after completion. Their goal was to secure strength, stability, and blessing for the structure. The rituals treated a building as something that could be protected spiritually as well as physically. At foundation corners, durable materials were placed as offerings, and prayers asked the gods to grant the building the same firmness as the metals hidden beneath it. Such ceremonies were expensive and therefore not ordinary. They were most likely performed for royal buildings, major temples, and elite houses. The logic was consistent. If a structure represented power, it required both engineering and ritual protection. Excavations in several major Hittite cities have uncovered caches beneath foundations that match what these texts describe. What the ritual texts depict, archaeology sometimes confirms in the ground. One ceremony, described in a compact and almost coded way, offers an unusually vivid glimpse of builders at work. It begins with offerings made at the start of the project, directed not toward the visible walls but toward the unseen foundations. A formula is recited to drive away harmful forces from the construction zone and from the boundaries of the future house. The scene then shifts to the raising of major wooden elements. A flat-roofed building requires heavy beams, crosspieces, and long supports that must be hauled upward. At this moment, the chief builder is not only an organizer but a performer in a dangerous act of skill. According to the ritual description, the master craftsman climbs upward on a rope, repeatedly ascending toward the roofline. Singers circle near the hearth as the work continues, turning the construction site into something like a staged ceremony. On the decisive climb, the craftsman cuts a loop used in lifting the heavy beams, a small action with big, symbolic weight. It marks the moment when the structure's skeleton has been set into place. Applause follows, led by an official whose role is to acknowledge the success of the act. Then, attention turns to a belt hanging from above, containing a silver axe and a silver knife. The belt is cut so that the tools fall. When the craftsman descends, he bows before the owner. Finally, he leaves, taking the silver tools with him as payment. This is not written like a detailed manual. It is short, compressed, and assumes knowledge that the text never explains. That is precisely why it matters. It suggests that the audience already understood the steps of construction and the symbolism layered onto them. Interpreting such a text requires stepping outside the words and imagining the building itself. A structure described in this ritual seems to have been organized around key wooden supports. A central post appears, with additional posts positioned to either side. The central support stands out because the owner is said to sit in front of it, giving it a ceremonial importance. Such a post is easily understood as the main vertical support of the roof structure, the element that carries the load and anchors the roof's ridge. Archaeological remains offer two possible matches for these supports. Some buildings show recesses within walls where large timbers were once embedded, later lost to decay or fire. Other buildings reveal stone bases that once carried freestanding wooden columns arranged inside the rooms. In large halls, flat earth roofs were heavy, and a greater number of supports was required. Some structures show rows of column bases, not necessarily to hold up the roof alone, but also to support interior installations, such as shelves. Whatever the exact arrangement in each case, the key point is clear. These posts were visible features within the building, significant enough to receive offerings even after construction. The ritual also highlights the critical importance of roof beams. Among all timber elements, the main beams were the hardest to obtain, the most difficult to transport, and the most essential to stability. Other texts indicate that carpenters were paid drastically different wages depending on the type of wood they were cutting. The highest payment went to those procuring the most important beams, suggesting that the best timbers did not always come from nearby forests. Even if the region around the capital was wooded, long straight trunks suitable for major buildings may have had to be sourced from farther afield. The roof, in other words, was not merely a final layer. It was the decisive stage that determined whether a building could survive the winter. The rope climbing sequence emphasizes how dramatic that stage was. It turns construction into spectacle, and spectacle into authority. The builder appears fearless, agile, and indispensable, someone who controls both technique and ritual power. The ceremony also shows how practical work and symbolic performance could merge into a single event. The craftsman secures the structure physically, then seals it ritually, and finally receives valuable payment. In this moment, the architect is more than a worker. He becomes a figure who mediates between the human project and divine protection. There is even a hint in these traditions that Hittite builders experimented with binding materials that resemble early cement-like compounds. Texts describe powders produced by grinding stone and mixing it with other substances used to make objects for ritual purposes. Even if such mixtures were not applied as construction material in the modern sense, the idea itself matters. It suggests a willingness to explore how crushed stone and binders could create something new, another sign that Hittite building culture was both practical and inventive. When all these strands are placed together, a broader picture emerges. Hittite monumental architecture was not a single invention but a system. Local Anatolian traditions expanded by state power, stone adopted as the language of permanence, foundations engineered with care, timber structures raised through coordinated labour, and the entire process surrounded by ceremonies, meant to guarantee durability. The lack of formal building inscriptions leaves modern observers uncertain about the original purpose of many ruins. Yet the rituals, strangely enough, bring the construction site back to life. They show a society that did not separate engineering from belief or craftsmanship from symbolism. In a society where conquest and military power stood at the centre of public life, and where much of cultural expression had been adopted from the older peoples of Anatolia and from Mesopotamia, the search for a rich and original literary tradition among the Hittites often leads to disappointment. The Hittite language was effective when describing campaigns, sieges, and political commands. Yet, it struggled to express the complex and abstract ideas found in works, translated from Babylonian or Hurrian originals. Texts brought from Babylonia rarely carried literary beauty in their new form, but those adapted from Hurrian, Hattian, and other Anatolian tongues became priceless, for the originals of those works have long disappeared. What survives in Hittite is therefore a unique collection, almost a rescued memory of vanished literatures. The written heritage of the Hittites was preserved in what modern scholars call archives, though this term can easily mislead. These were not libraries in the familiar sense, nor grand buildings devoted to reading and study. The Hittites had no institution resembling a public library. Instead, tablets were kept in what might be called tablet houses or tablet rooms, practical storage spaces inside temples, palaces, and administrative buildings. The greatest concentration of such material has been uncovered at the capital, Hattusa, but important groups were also found at Ortaköy and Mashat, while smaller collections appeared in cities far beyond the core land, such as Alala and Ugarit. Hattusa never possessed a single central archive. Tablets lay scattered across the city, in rooms of the great temple in the lower town, in the buildings of the royal citadel known as Buyukale, in houses along the slopes, and in structures connected with religious and economic administration. The famous bronze treaty tablet, recording an agreement with King Kurunta, was not discovered in an orderly room at all, but discarded beneath paving stones near the city walls. Such finds reveal that written documents lived and died with the daily life of institutions, rather than resting in a protected scholarly environment. Within these rooms, tablets were organised with surprising care. Stone bases supported wooden shelves on which clay documents were arranged in rows, much like books, in a later age. Small label tablets, noting the content of larger texts, were placed at the front, so that scribes could quickly locate what they needed. This practical system shows that writing served real administrative and ritual needs. None of this would have been possible without the scribes. Almost nothing is known of their education, yet it is clear they mastered several languages and scripts. Many were of foreign origin, especially Hurrian and Babylonian, and their long training prepared them for high office. Some became politicians, diplomats, and even physicians. Their pride in their craft appears in occasional remarks boasting of writing many long tablets in a single day. Through their hands, the literature of many lands entered Anatolia. Writing itself reached the Hittite world relatively late. During the earlier Assyrian trading period, Anatolian peoples did not adopt the script used by the foreign merchants. Only with the rise of the Hittite state did the need for writing become urgent. Campaigns into northern Syria brought skilled captives, among them scribes who adapted Babylonian cuneiform to the Hittite tongue. Alongside clay tablets, the Hittites also used wooden boards coated with wax, probably written in hieroglyphic signs for everyday records that have not survived. When the new script was first employed, literary works appeared with remarkable speed. How such a young written language produced narratives and rituals so quickly remains a mystery. Perhaps older oral traditions were suddenly recorded, or foreign scribes guided the process. Early texts were mainly historical and administrative, and only gradually did more refined expression develop. One of the earliest masterpieces is the political testament of King Hattusa. In this speech, the aging ruler explains why he removed his own son from succession and adopted his nephew, Mursili. The tone is simple, almost severe. The king demands modest living, obedience, and endurance from his family and soldiers. He portrays the rejected heir as cold and unfeeling, while the chosen boy is presented as fragile and in need of protection. The artistry lies not in ornate language, but in the power to convince listeners that the decision was unavoidable. Another group of texts, known as Palace Chronicles, consists of harsh anecdotes meant to warn officials. They describe deceitful governors, cruel punishments, and the relentless authority of the crown. Their style is rough and unadorned, reflecting a world where life was dangerous and loyalty fragile. Through such stories, the new state sought to intimidate local populations and enforce order. In the later imperial age, literature changed character. The gods entered the narrative more strongly, influenced by Mesopotamian theology. Historical writing reached its peak in royal annals, especially under Mursili II. These yearly accounts record routes, weather, diplomacy, and the morale of troops with sober precision. The king speaks as commander and witness, rarely exaggerating. Yet divine support is constantly invoked, reminding readers that victory belonged to the gods as much as to men. A striking example of self-justifying literature is the defense composed by Hattusa III after he seized the throne from his nephew. He portrays his life as guided by the goddess Ishtar, surrounded by enemies, always innocent. Through clever reasoning, he turns political ambition into destiny, producing one of the earliest known works of apologetic writing. Prayers and confessions reveal another side of Hittite thought. During years of plague, Mursili II addressed the storm god with desperate honesty, admitting ancestral crimes and begging for mercy so that the remaining people might continue to serve the gods. Individuals likewise cried out in personal laments, describing sleepless nights and fear of death. Such texts anticipate later traditions of confession. The richest imaginative creations came from myth and legend, largely inherited from Hurrian and Hattian traditions. The tale of the dragon Iluyanka, defeated through cunning at a spring festival, and the story of the god Telepinu, who vanished in anger causing famine, were told to explain the rhythms of nature. In these narratives, bees search for the missing deity, awaken him with their sting, and restore fertility to the land. Similar motifs appear across the eastern Mediterranean. From Hurrian myth also came the cycle of Kumabi, recounting battles for kingship in heaven, a tradition that later inspired Greek stories of Uranus, Kronos, and Zeus. The landscape of Cilicia, with its dramatic sinkholes and caves, preserved memories of these struggles well into classical times. Other stories speak of hunters, lovers, and fools. The adventure of Kessi warns against neglecting the gods for earthly desire. The tale of Apu tells of a wealthy but childless man whose sons named Good and Evil quarrel over inheritance. A fragment describes monsters that devour people, perhaps reflecting fears from the northern frontier. Folklore preserved curious memories, such as the legend of a queen who cast 30 newborn sons into a river. They survived and unknowingly married their sisters. Such themes echo far beyond Anatolia and hint at deep layers of tradition. Literary style even entered legal defences, where accused men pleaded with emotional metaphors, comparing themselves to bent reeds or flowing tears. Oratory became a weapon in court and before the gods. By the 15th century before the Common Era, cities like Hattusa, Arina, and Suppiluliuma had become centres of a cosmopolitan culture. Officials and priests, artisans and foreigners lived together, demanding stories that addressed creation, fate, and the afterlife. Translation from many languages fed this appetite. Had the empire not collapsed around 1200, a distinctive Anatolian school of philosophy might have emerged centuries before the thinkers of the Aegean. In the world of the Hittites, short sayings and popular expressions existed much like the proverbs of later cultures, yet they were never gathered into collections. They appeared scattered inside myths, legal texts, and royal speeches, emerging naturally from everyday speech. There was not even a specific word for proverb. Writers simply remarked that people usually say, or it is the custom among humans. From these fragments, a glimpse of Hittite wisdom can be reconstructed. Many of these expressions reveal attitudes toward life, fate, and morality. The gods, it was said, always felt compassion for a woman giving birth. A soldier was reminded, "Eat your rations and do your duty." Another phrase advised modesty. "Eat the bread and drink the water," meaning, be content with what you have. Trust in divine favour appeared in the saying that the sun, God places bread on the table of the person he loves. Practical realism spoke through lines such as "the dog barks," but when it arrives it falls silent, or "the deaf do not hear, the blind do not see." Suffering and anxiety were described in vivid metaphors. One line compared inner turmoil to a spirit jumping from place to place because of illness. Fire was said to burn the one who stands at the front, a warning about reckless leadership. Agricultural imagery expressed hope for growth. Just as a ploughed field yields 3 or 4 times what was sown, so a person's strength might increase manyfold. Yet folly brought ruin. The house of a foolish man was built on a floodplain, and when the waters came, it would be swept away to the sea. Some sayings praised character. A good woman, according to tradition, possessed reason and dignity, knew how to free herself from human oppression, yet remained faithful to divine will, and never rejected the words of her husband. Others reflected the harshness of life. The gods place one lion upon the throne of another, suggesting that power always replaces power. The dog, often considered unclean, could devour even a precious cart if given the chance. Wealth, it was believed, rarely abandoned the truly rich. Moral lessons were direct. People were warned not to celebrate the misfortune of an enemy, for the same fate might return. Obedience was valued. A servant should be loyal and not raise his head in pride. One should not attempt to make evil appear good. Nature itself was used as a teacher. Trees break their own branches, but a deer never kills its young. Everyday observations turned into ethical advice. The dog howls, the pig grunts. Life and death remain uncertain. Even if a wife dies, the son-in-law remains family. Other phrases touched on law and justice. To call someone a wolf meant that he had taken revenge into his own hands instead of waiting for legal judgment. The sins of a father were believed to pass to his son. Gossip spread because people were base. Divine justice was patient. The will of the gods might be slow, yet once it caught the guilty, it would not easily release them. Language itself was praised as the bridge that connects people. Among the few humorous pieces preserved is a brief anecdote from the Syrian coast. A Hittite who had spent 5 years in prison was told that he would soon be free. Instead of rejoicing, he grew anxious. The joke is difficult to grasp today, yet it hints that life outside might have seemed more frightening than the familiar routine of confinement, or perhaps the prison had offered unexpected comfort. Hittite storytelling reached its highest level in grand myths, the most impressive being the tale of Ulukumi. This narrative, originally Hurrian in spirit, describes the eternal struggle for power among the gods. Kumarbi, father of the deities, sought revenge against his son, the storm god. To overthrow him, he created a monstrous being from stone. The creature was born from a union between Kumarbi and a great rock rising from the sea. Ancient listeners imagined this sea as a cold and mysterious place, perhaps a vast inland lake or the northern waters beyond the mountains. The newborn giant was named Ulukumi, destroyer of the city of Kumiya, and was hidden beneath the waves on the shoulder of a primeval being who carried the world. There he grew at terrifying speed, rising like a fortress tower until his head touched the heavens. The sun god first noticed the threat and hurried to warn the storm god. From a sacred mountain, the storm god and his sister gazed upon the monster and were filled with dread. Attempts were made to defeat the giant through force and through enchantment. The goddess of love tried to charm him with music and beauty, yet he was deaf and blind to emotion. Battles followed in which armies of gods were thrown back like birds scattered by a storm. Finally, wisdom prevailed. The ancient deity Ea revealed the existence of a primeval saw that had once separated earth from sky. With this tool, the gods cut the giant from the base on which he stood, weakening him at last. The myth ends with the expectation that order will be restored and the storm god will reclaim his throne. More important than the conclusion is the drama itself, the fear of chaos, the fragile balance between generations of gods, and the belief that intelligence can overcome brute strength. Through such stories, the Hittites expressed their understanding of power, loyalty, and the unpredictable forces that shape the world. How can a sword speak, and how can it stay silent? In the ancient world, objects sometimes carried a second life beyond their metal and shape. A clever mind could leave behind two kinds of traces: things written down and things made by hand. Most weapons belong to the second category only. They survive as artifacts, but they do not explain themselves. Yet once in a while, a weapon crosses the line and becomes a storyteller. An inscription turns cold bronze into a witness. It names people, places, motives, victories, and gifts. That is what makes one particular Hittite sword feel as if it has a voice, while another, equally real, equally old, remains stubbornly mute. The sword was more than a tool of killing in the Hittite world. It was one of the most effective weapons on the battlefield, but its meaning stretched far beyond combat. A sword signalled rank and authority. Soldiers carried them, but so did kings, high officials, elite guards, and even the gods in religious imagery. In reliefs carved into rock, it is difficult to find a figure, human or divine, who does not wear a blade at the belt. These depictions repeat a striking detail. Many of the hilts curve into a crescent-like form, a recognizable silhouette that becomes almost a signature of the Hittite style. The weapon appears not only as equipment, but as a symbol that someone belongs to power, ritual, and responsibility. One sword, however, stands apart because it carries words. It was found near the Hittite imperial capital, in the harsh ground outside a monumental gate, in terrain that looks empty until the earth suddenly reveals what it has been hiding. During rough roadwork in the late 20th century, heavy machinery cut into the soil and a bronze blade came up unexpectedly. Workers turned it in, and the object moved from dirt and chance into careful hands. The sword itself is long and well made, cast from hard bronze, with a balanced, purposeful shape. But its true value lies in something smaller than its length. A short inscription cut into the metal in cuneiform script. That inscription transforms the weapon into a historical document. It identifies a great king and ties the sword to a specific campaign. The text tells of a major military victory in the land called Asua. It describes the king returning from that campaign with captured weapons, and then presenting the swords as a religious offering to the storm god. In other words, the sword does not merely exist as a piece of bronze. It states that it was part of a victory, part of plunder taken in war, and part of a public act of devotion. The blade becomes a bridge between battlefield and sanctuary, between violence and ritual, between human ambition and divine favour. There is another reason this find matters. For a long time, swords of this shape were often linked mainly with the Aegean world, as if their origins belonged elsewhere and Anatolia only received them. This blade complicates that simple picture. Here is an Anatolian example, securely rooted in Hittite royal ideology, showing that such weapon forms were not merely imported trophies or foreign fashion. The style fits the visual language seen in Hittite representations, and the message engraved on the metal ties it directly to the Hittite state and its gods. The sword is not only a weapon, it is a statement of identity. Then there is the silent sword. It belongs to the same family of shapes, and it echoes the same design choices, including the characteristic hilt form. It was discovered far from the capital, in a cold, secluded place where nature preserves and conceals at the same time. Hidden in ice within a cave, another bronze blade survived long enough to be found in an almost unreal condition, protected by the freezing environment like something sealed in a time capsule. Yet this sword carries no inscription. It offers no names, no victory, no dedication. It refuses to explain how it travelled there, who wielded it, or why it ended up in such an isolated landscape. It is, in that sense, completely silent. Even so, silence does not mean emptiness. When the two blades are placed side by side in the imagination, the speaking sword with its carved testimony and the mute sword with only its form, patterns begin to appear. The second sword's technique and profile align closely with the first. Its proportions and stylistic details place it in the same broad group, as if both came from a shared tradition of craftsmanship. The crescent hilt motif, the way the blade is shaped, the overall manufacturing approach. These elements match what Hittite art repeatedly shows and what written sources imply about weapons as prestigious objects. A sword like this was not just a tool a man happened to own. It was a marker of status, a piece of official culture, something that belonged to the world of kings and organized warfare. Together, the two finds push toward a clear conclusion. These swords should not be treated as outsiders that drifted into Anatolia from the west. The evidence points the other way. Anatolia, and the Hittite sphere in particular, appears as a strong centre of production for this type of weapon. The speaking sword gives the historical context, while the silent sword confirms the style through physical presence. One offers words, the other offers form. Both suggest that the Hittites developed a distinctive sword type and a confident tradition of bronze weapon making. The Aegean world may have known similar shapes, but the best preserved, most telling examples are not waiting on the far side of the sea. They are emerging from Anatolian soil and ice, carrying the weight of a local craft and a local history. This is why a sword can be said to talk. Not because it truly has a voice, but because sometimes metal is allowed to carry memory. An inscription turns an object into a witness. A second blade, shaped the same way, but lacking words, forces the story to be built from clues rather than statements. Between the two, a larger picture comes into focus. The Hittite sword was a weapon of war, a badge of prestige, a symbol worn by humans and gods, and in rare cases a written message that survived the collapse of an empire